Okay. So welcome everyone. So we are here just to discuss the book written by Katherine Puddifoot, How Stereotypes Deceive Us, which was published in Oxford University Press in 2021. And Katherine is going to give an introduction, and then the other speakers will just present some comments, problems, and finally Katherine will just answer to the other speakers. So Katherine, do you want to start?
Yes, share my screen. Okay, everything look good? Okay, well, I want to start off by thanking you all for your various contributions. Marina, of course, for organising, and the commentators. This book came out in 2021, so I haven't had many opportunities really to discuss it in the same way I might have done under other circumstances. So this is really excellent. So I'm going to give a quick overview. I've got 15 minutes officially, and hopefully I'll get done in something like that time. I'm going to go through the various chapters and say something about each of them. It won't be very much, certainly won't be as much as you might need to fully understand, but I'm going to say something. Okay, so the overall aim of the book is to provide an account of the epistemology of stereotyping, an understanding of the various ways that stereotypes lead people to misperceive and misunderstand other social actors, but also events. The first main chapter, beyond the introduction, does some work defining stereotyping as it's understood in the book. The definition that I defend is this one: a social attitude that associates members of some social group more strongly than others with certain traits. Stereotyping, as I'm talking about it here, is applying this type of social attitude to individual social actors or events. There are a few notable features of this definition that might come up in discussion. One is that it's a comparative definition. So the social attitudes are such that they make a comparison between different social groups, associating some more strongly than others with certain traits. The definition is designed to be general enough to apply to explicit and implicit stereotypes. So if people don't explicitly endorse a stereotype, but they make an association that between a certain social group and a certain trait more than other social groups, then it can count as a stereotype on this definition. And it's also a non-normative definition. So in the literature on stereotyping, there's often a distinction made between normative and non-normative accounts, where normative accounts define stereotypes and stereotyping in terms of the falsity of the stereotypes and the way that they lead to distorted judgments. I don't, for various reasons, endorse that sort of approach, instead having a non-normative approach where stereotypes can have the negative effects that the normative approach suggests that they can have, but also have the potential to not have those negative effects. So moving on from that definition, I then defend what I call a multifactorial approach to stereotyping. Basically, the idea that there are more factors that determine whether or not an act of stereotyping increases or decreases the chance of an accurate judgment being made than would commonly be understood to exist. So I characterize and critique two general approaches that people might have to understanding stereotyping and the way that stereotypes might lead to misperceptions or not do so. So on the single factor view, if a stereotype reflects an aspect of social reality, then the application of the stereotype is likely to increase the chance of a correct judgment being made. You might not find many people explicitly endorsing this view, but I actually think it's one that's operative in many discussions about or intuitive understandings of stereotypes and stereotyping. The dual factor view is one that I think you find in the work of people like José, where the idea is that a stereotype doesn't only have to reflect an aspect of social reality, it has to accurately do that. And on top of that, Something else that determines whether or not the application of the stereotype is helpful or not epistemically is the availability of unambiguous information. So if there's a situation where all the information that's available is ambiguous information and you've got an accurate stereotype, then in that sort of case, it's likely that the application of the stereotype will help you to make a correct judgment. So I characterize those views, and we might have some discussion, I think, about the characterization of those views. Part of the motivation for laying those out as they are, apart from just I think that they're actually fairly intuitive views and a lot of people tacitly endorse them, is I think that they provide a good jumping off point for understanding that there are actually far more different ways that the application of a stereotype can influence your chances of making a correct judgment. So there are various different factors, I think, that can determine whether or not the application of a stereotype can be a good or a bad thing epistemically. One thing is the relevance of the stereotype to the judgment, the idea being that you might have a stereotype that is accurate, but if that stereotype is applied when it doesn't speak to the truth of the judgment that's being made or pertain to the truth of the judgment being made, then the application of the stereotype is unlikely to be helpful epistemically. I know that some of the commentators have some issue with my definition of relevance, so we can talk about that more. I think it'd be really helpful. But on top of that, I emphasize various ways that when a stereotype is applied, that can lead to a distorted response to the specific information about the individual social act or event to which the stereotype is applied. I won't go through them individually, but the idea is that if you look at the psychology literature, if you look at the philosophy literature more broadly, if you look at the literature from sociology and other disciplines, then you find reason to think that the application of a stereotype, even an accurate stereotype, as I discuss further in the next chapter, can lead to the information about a specific case being responded to in a poor way. The person whose stereotypes can fail to access or properly process the information that they have available to them in their environment about individuals to whom they stereotype. Okay, so the idea is that you need to factor in the accuracy of a stereotype, you need to factor in the ambiguity or lack of ambiguity of the information, but you also need to factor in lots of other things to determine whether or not an act of stereotyping is likely to produce an accurate judgment. This also means that if you're assessing or critiquing a particular act of stereotyping, there are numerous different factors that you can take into consideration. In a way, one way of looking at this is that it provides more ways of criticizing a particular act of stereotyping, more different features that you can look towards identifying in a person when they engage in stereotyping to critique their stereotyping. Okay. The next chapter introduces this notion of epistemic innocence, which Lisa Bortolotti, who I used to work with, and Emma Bissett and various of my other colleagues have been working on developing. And I use this notion because I think it's useful to capture the way that there can actually be significant epistemic benefits associated with having false beliefs in the place of stereotyping beliefs. So my claim is that there can be significant epistemic costs associated with stereotyping, the sorts of costs that I've outlined in the multifactorial view, so the way that stereotypes can lead to distorted responses to individuals and information about them. Those epistemic costs aren't tied to the inaccuracy of a stereotype. They are separate, they're separate factors, not to be treated as the same, which means that you can have epistemic costs associated with stereotypes that actually arguably could be said to be accurate, remembering that I'm adopting a non-normative approach to stereotyping, which means that you might actually be able to avoid some epistemic costs associated with stereotyping by having in the place of a stereotype that might reflect reality an egalitarian belief that doesn't do so. So one example that I reach for in various cases is the example of scientific expertise. So rather than having a stereotype associating scientific expertise more strongly with men than women, you might have an egalitarian belief that women and men are equally likely to have scientific expertise. This might not reflect the reality in your society, but it could bring epistemic benefits. So here, this false egalitarian belief could be said to be epistemically innocent, where epistemic innocence happens when you have an attitude, most commonly a belief, that could easily be characterized in terms of its flaws, its inaccuracy, its irrationality, but actually at the same time brings significant epistemic benefits by avoiding costs that would follow from the accurate belief. So the idea is that if you had a social attitude that reflects the reality in your society, that men are more likely to have scientific expertise than women, this would bring various harms, but those harms, epistemic harms, can be avoided by having the egalitarian belief. And so this is supposed to sort of challenge, I think, a belief that, again, intuitively, but also, like, I think this is like there in a lot of work in epistemology, the idea that what's epistemically good is to have the belief that's supported by the evidence that you have available in your environment. And it really should be a significant point against a belief if it's not reflecting information or evidence available in your environment. My claim here is that there can be significant benefits which can in some cases outweigh the costs of having a false belief. Okay, so moving on from this, I really don't think I can do justice to this chapter in this space of time, so I'm just going to point generally to this next chapter where I look at this dilemma that Tamar Gendler has spoken about, where it seems like where a stereotype might reflect reality, which is talking about implicit bias, but where an association like that might reflect reality, you could have epistemic demands not to harbor or be influenced by it, but these can come into conflict with the epistemic demand to have a belief that reflects the statistical reality. Basically, my thoughts on this are that the situation is just really complex. Sometimes you might seem to have a conflict between your ethical goal and doing the epistemically right thing of encoding that background information in your stereotype. Sometimes actually it seems like maybe the best thing from an epistemic and an ethical perspective will be to stereotype, which might seem really counterintuitive if you have a negative definition of stereotyping. Sometimes your epistemic and ethical goals will point in the other direction. And I spell out this idea by looking at a case study of stereotyping in medicine. So that's what happened there. But next, instead of focusing on the situation faced by a person that might stereotype, so when Gendler's talking about people facing a dilemma, the idea is that people can face a dilemma with respect to their own stereotyping. So if they engage in the stereotyping, then they might suffer some ethical costs and might be doing something ethically wrong, but gain some epistemic benefits, although the picture is more complex than that in Gendler's work. But the idea is that the focus is on the person who is engaging in the stereotyping and a dilemma that they might face. Whereas in chapter 6 of the book, I focus on the situation of the person who has an aspect of their social identity that they might or might not disclose, which is likely to lead to them being stereotyped. My case study here being a person with a mental health issue. The idea is that the multifactorial account of stereotyping points towards various different ways that if they do divulge information about their mental health, they're likely to be stereotyped and misperceived as such. But then if they don't do so, they're also likely to be misperceived because their behavior might be understood to be indicative of them being lazy or having a bad character, when really is an indication of them having the mental health issue, which isn't properly understood because they've not divulged information about their situation. So focusing then on the person who might be stereotyped, I think that there's a really important to notice dilemma or that they face in terms of disclosure, and that problem is especially pronounced because they don't have the control over whether other people stereotype. So if you look to the psychology literature, obviously there's some debate about the effectiveness of various strategies that can be used to combat stereotyping, but in most cases those strategies will involve the person who's stereotyping putting some effort in and them having control over whether or not they, for example, engage in contact with members of a group they might stereotype in a productive way that might challenge the stereotypes. But from the perspective of the person who might disclose information about themselves, they don't have the power to prevent other people stereotyping by getting them to engage in those sorts of strategies. So it seems like the dilemma that they face is particularly pronounced, I'm saying here, particularly serious. But it also seems to push us in the direction of thinking that where structural changes can be made, those structural changes are particularly important if you look at the situation from the perspective of the person who might be disclosing the information about themselves, because those structural changes, where they can prevent people stereotyping, don't depend on the motivation of the person who might stereotype to shift the stereotypes. So if it were possible to change social structures in various ways to reduce the stereotyping of people with mental health issues, then you wouldn't be so dependent on the person who might stereotype to prevent themselves stereotyping, and the person who faces a dilemma over disclosure would face less of a dilemma, because they would the risk of them being negatively impacted by someone else's stereotyping would be minimized or reduced at least. Okay, and then this is like the final component of the book, where I argue for a view I call evaluative dispositionalism. So first, in one chapter, I basically argue that existing approaches to justification and rationality, defended in epistemology, are each going to be, this is a bold claim, please point me towards an account that isn't going to be inadequate in this way, but each going to be inadequate to capture all of the epistemic thoughts associated with stereotyping. So I divide the different approaches up into three types of approach: upstream approaches, downstream approaches, and static approaches, where upstream approaches focus on the causal history of a belief, whether a belief is formed in a way that reflects the evidence, responsibly formed via a process that tends to produce true beliefs, if you're a sort of reliabilist. So I think that whilst those sorts of approaches can capture some things that are wrong about some acts of stereotyping, sometimes people stereotype and the stereotypes just don't reflect reality at all. There will be some cases of stereotyping where something significant is going wrong, which isn't captured by looking at the history of the stereotyping, because the problem that you want to point towards and criticize actually comes in the way that once a person has a stereotype, they're disposed to respond poorly to information and evidence about those to whom they stereotype. So the idea is that the upstream approaches won't capture something significant, basic consequences of harboring a stereotype. In contrast to this, downstream approaches focus on the consequences of believing, and they're going to be very good in capturing those sorts of issues, the way that people are disposed to respond poorly when they harbour the stereotype. But it seems like you don't want to be in a situation where you're focusing solely on that, because where someone has a stereotype that they've formed through ignorance and like motivated reasoning, willful ignorance, then you don't want to be saying that the history that led them to have that stereotype is irrelevant. So there's something missing to those downstream approaches too. And static approaches don't focus on the history or the consequences of believing, but instead on the status of the belief itself. So something like a coherentist approach would be an example of this, where you evaluate the belief not for its history or consequences, but for its relationship to other beliefs in the belief set. So in that sort of case, I think, again, you're not going to capture all the faults of stereotyping, because you're going to have these cases where the consequences are really important, also where the what happens upstream is really important. But you also might have a situation where actually the coherentist approach ends up endorsing a stereotype because someone has a stereotype and it fits really well with their wider belief system, and various, because they've got this sort of stealthy stereotype like this, so like a really pernicious form of prejudice. So each of these approaches seem to capture something potentially about what's wrong with stereotyping, but not everything. So I sort of conclude this negative chapter by saying we need to be more pluralistic, try and capture the advantages, avoid the disadvantages of these various approaches. And I think that one way to do this, given the general characterization of the problems with stereotyping throughout the book, is to focus on dispositions. So evaluative dispositionalism is supposed to capture this idea that's kind of there in the earlier work on how stereotypes lead people to respond to case-specific information about the individual. The idea is that if you have the stereotype, even if it's accurate, even if it's applied when it's relevant, it can have downstream costs because it can dispose people to make all sorts of errors, fall into various epistemic pitfalls. So like, it seems like we want to capture that in our approach to stereotyping. But we also want to capture the way that sometimes people end up stereotyping because they're just disposed not to respond to the evidence informing a stereotyping belief. So if I have this sort of like willful ignorance that leads me to believe certain things about certain groups, and this displays something about my disposition not to just form beliefs without responding to evidence in doing so, that also seems to be important. So evaluative dispositionalism is intended to capture like both of these things. It says that a complete epistemic evaluation of an act of believing should focus on both the dispositions that are displayed in believing and the dispositions that are possessed due to believing. So you focus on, well, you know, what has someone shown themselves to be in terms of their dispositions when they form this belief? How are they disposed to behave in response to having this belief? The focus is particularly on epistemic dispositions, so dispositions that influence whether truth or falsities are believed. More specifically, dispositions related to how a person responds to evidence that they encounter. So the idea is that you should focus on how people are disposed to respond to evidence. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to do justice to this. I'm going to generally point towards some advantages I think this approach has. I think it's very good at capturing a variety of different cases. So where a stereotype reflects the evidence, has poor consequences where it doesn't, it has poor consequences where it does, and it has poor consequences, and so on. So I think there are a range of different cases. I give some examples, hopefully they're fairly convincing, that I think are cases of stereotyping that evaluative dispositionalism does quite well in capturing. So one worry you might have about a pluralistic approach is that it's going to be difficult to apply. So remember that I'm saying at the end of the critical chapter that there are these advantages of the various different approaches we want to try and capture, but you might be worried that, well, you know, if we're going to actually evaluate an act of stereotyping, there's a lot to factor in, but actually evaluative dispositionalism, at least, again, something that's going to be discussed later, but it gives like a single piece of advice, which is that you should focus on dispositions. And I think that that bit of advice is likely not to lead you to run into too much trouble, but again, we can discuss it later. So I think that there's prescriptive force to this sort of approach, because you can encourage people to focus on their own dispositions, how stereotypes might be leading them to respond, but also to focus on other people's. And it has this, which I think really satisfying result, that it implies that people can have the same stereotype. They can have the same stereotype as a result of growing up in the same society and being exposed to the same information, but they can be evaluated differently if they're disposed as a result of having the stereotype to respond in a different way to evidence. So two people could have the same stereotype, the same belief that associates one group more strongly than others with a certain characteristic, that men are more likely than women to have scientific expertise, but that can influence their thinking in different ways. And if one person is influenced in such a way that they're disposed to respond poorly to evidence, that can be captured by this approach and contrasted to the person who responds better to evidence as a result of this. And I think that it's worth mentioning that, you know, this has the potential to perform some sort of social role. So it emphasizes how once we've internalized social attitudes, they can have this pernicious effect of leading people to respond poorly to evidence, and that we should focus on that as well as the extent to which the stereotype reflects the evidence available to the person when they form the stereotype. Okay, so that's me done. I'm very interested to hear what everyone has to say.
Well, thank you, Katherine. I know that it's difficult to try to summarize a whole book in just some minutes, but well, thank you for this. It's very helpful for the people who didn't read the book. So now we are going to go to the commentators. So it's Federico Picinali who is going to start. He's a professor of law at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the UK. So Federico, I know you have to share your screen, so maybe Katherine, you can just stop sharing because I don't think he can share if you don't stop. Yes.
Okay, great. You should be able to see my slides, right? Can you see them?
Yes, yes, of course.
Okay, great, excellent. Okay. So first of all, obviously, I wanted to thank Marina for organizing this symposium, and to thank Kathy for writing this book and therefore giving us the opportunity to be here and do some philosophy together. My talk is, is by and large like critical of some of the arguments and claims that Kathy makes. I see it as my task as a discussant to be as critical as is reasonable to be. But I think some words of praise are in order, and these are that, in my view, the book makes some very valuable and thought-provoking contributions to the debate on stereotypes. I was planning on mentioning a few, but Kathy has already given us an excellent summary of the book, so that I don't have to do that. And no doubt we will be discussing some of these contributions during the meeting today. At a more general level, I think one of the reasons why I really enjoyed reading this book is because it combines like very refined theoretical discussion with a rich apparatus of realistic examples. And especially for someone like me who knows the debate on stereotypes up to a point, I'm not an expert on this debate. It was very helpful to have this rich apparatus, because at every turn of the book, I would be reminded of why the theoretical discussion matters. So I'd say, if you've read the book, I hope you share my positive views about it. If you haven't, I strongly recommend that you read it, and I'm sure you will have not only an enjoyable but a very enriching experience from a philosophical point of view. Great. So now I come to my critical comments, which are basically 4 points, and for each of them I have a couple of slides. Okay, so 8 slides in total. The first point pertains to Kathy's discussion in chapter 4 of the epistemic benefits of avoiding stereotyping. So she's already given us a definition of a stereotype. I'm gonna have to minimize this, otherwise I can't see my slides. So I'm sorry, I'm not able to see your faces at the moment. I hope you won't fall asleep, of course. So the definition of the stereotype that she gives is that of a social attitude that associates members of some social group more strongly than others with certain traits. An example, which Kathy has already mentioned, and that comes up in the book at several points, is that of an attitude that associates scientific expertise more strongly with men than women. Now, with respect to this specific stereotype, we can say, and Kathy says, that, great, it reflects social reality in that, so I'm just trying to do this accent. It reflects social reality, especially with reference to the United Kingdom, because in the United Kingdom, there are significantly more men in the sciences than there are women. But it being a stereotype, it leads to epistemic pitfalls. Kathy has already spoken about these pitfalls. Chapter 3 is all dedicated to explaining on the basis of empirical evidence what these pitfalls are, how they come about. But they include like misinterpreting, ignoring, or remembering selectively the evidence, so that the recognized evidence fits and confirms the stereotype, giving a credibility deficit to the testimony of those who are stereotyped. So in other words, if I hold the stereotype and I am presented with the testimony of a woman scientist, I am likely, say, to commit testimonial injustice against this person, or perhaps to ignore evidence of this person's expertise, and so on and so forth. Now, compare this with an egalitarian attitude. An egalitarian attitude, by definition, is not a stereotype. Okay, so this is an attitude that associates with equal strength a trait with two groups. with two social groups. Okay, so an example here could be the attitude that women and men are equally likely to have scientific expertise. Now, what about this attitude in particular? Well, we can say that it does not reflect social reality, not in the UK at least, for the reasons that I've mentioned earlier. But at the same time, it doesn't lead to the epistemic pitfalls because it is not a stereotype. And in fact, at 75, Kathy tells us the possession of the attitude that women and men are equally likely to have scientific expertise will guard against various tendencies that accompany the stereotype associating scientific expertise more strongly with men than women. So the bottom line here is that the egalitarian attitude produces a less costly epistemic outcome. So there is a cost, so the fact that it doesn't reflect social reality, but there's a benefit. It doesn't lead to the epistemic pitfall. So considering this cost and benefit together and comparing it with that of adopting a stereotype, we can conclude that the epistemic costs of the egalitarian attitude are smaller. Okay. Now, my claim is that I'm putting it in tentative terms because I think this claim would actually have to be corroborated with empirical evidence, which I don't have. But perhaps the egalitarian nature of the attitude cannot alone guarantee the less costly epistemic outcome. Okay, why would I say this? Now consider an attitude according to which both men and women are extremely unlikely to have scientific expertise. Okay, now it is an egalitarian attitude, but this is my hypothesis. It is likely to lead to epistemic pitfalls with reference to both men and women. For example, if I am asked to adjudicate, say, whether a particular man or woman scientist has indeed scientific expertise, and I endorse this egalitarian attitude, well, perhaps I'm likely to, say, commit testimonial injustice towards them, like downplay their expertise, ignore evidence that they actually have that expertise, and so on and so forth. Why is that the case? Well, because notwithstanding that it's an egalitarian attitude, the strength with which I associate scientific expertise with men and women is extremely limited. Okay. So perhaps what's really egalitarian here is that the egalitarian nature of the attitude may mean that the distribution of epistemic errors is also egalitarian, right? So errors will equally affect the men and the women whose expertise I judge. But it doesn't necessarily mean that these errors are avoided or that they're less pronounced than in the case of stereotyping. Okay. So again, I put this as very tentative claims, but my intuition is that they are correct. So the egalitarian nature of the attitude per se does not guarantee a less costly epistemic outcome. So I now move to my second point. And my second point has to do with Kathy's discussion in chapter 2 of the problem here is that, sorry, the single factor and the dual factor view. There's quite a few things that overlap with my slides, so I don't really see them properly. But anyway, so Kathy has already talked about the single factor and the dual factor views. These are views concerning the factors that determine whether there is going to be an increase or a decrease of the chances of an accurate judgment if someone relies on a stereotype. And Kathy criticizes both views and presents her alternative view, which is the multifactorial view. Now, my point here has to do specifically with her treatment of the single factor view. Now, the single factor view says, and I'm quoting, "There's only one feature of any act of stereotyping that determines whether the application of the stereotype increases the chance of an accurate judgment being made. And this feature is whether or not the stereotype that is applied reflects some aspects of reality." Now, Kathy criticizes this, relying, among other things, on this example. And I'm quoting again. "Take, for example, the stereotype associating Black people more strongly than white people with drug crime. The stereotype could reflect an aspect of social reality, that is, high arrest rates among the Black population for drug use, while also leading to judgments that fail to fit accurate statistical information about actual rates of drug use, which are similar across Black and not Black populations." Like, to clarify, I mean, if I were to hold this stereotype, the stereotype might lead me to the judgment, say, that a Black acquaintance of mine is more likely to use drugs than a non-Black acquaintance of mine. And if I'm if I understand what Kathy is telling us here, well, this judgment can be said to reflect an aspect of social reality, this being the high arrest rate, or I prefer to say the higher arrest rate among the Black population for drug use. But at the same time, the judgment is likely to be inaccurate because it doesn't reflect the statistical reality about drug use. Okay, so this, Kathy suggests, shows that the single factor view is flawed. Okay, so we have a case where the stereotype reflects an aspect of social reality, and notwithstanding that, endorsing the stereotype, relying on the stereotype, does not increase the chances that our judgment is accurate. My question here is whether this reasoning is correct. I mean, the reasoning that pertains to this example in particular. Perhaps Kathy is right that the single factor view is flawed, but I don't think that this example shows that. And my claim, which is a bit of a composite claim, is the following. I'm going to then justify it later. So the stereotype about comparative drug use does not, in fact, reflect the aspect of social reality represented by arrest rates. Therefore, the single factor view would not indicate, in this case, that reliance on the stereotype increases the chances of making an accurate judgment concerning drug use. In other words, this view would likely lead to the same conclusion reached by Kathy about the accuracy of such a judgment. That is, that this judgment is likely to be inaccurate. To say one more time, my point is, perhaps she's right, the single factor view is flawed, but her treatment of this example doesn't show that. So how do I defend my claim? Well, first of all, I would say a judgment or a stereotype about the comparative likelihood or rate of drug use could meaningfully be said to reflect the comparative arrest rate only under the assumption that the comparative arrest rate tracks the comparative rate of drug use. I'm talking about comparative rates here, and by this I mean just a construct that combines the rates with respect to a certain people with the corresponding rate with respect to a different people. So to restate this point, a judgment about the comparative likelihood or rate of drug use could meaningfully be said to reflect the comparative arrest rate only under the assumption that the comparative arrest rate tracks the comparative rate of drug use. To see why, I consider the case in which the comparative arrest rate does not track the comparative rate of drug use. And this may be because, for example, due to racism in law enforcement, the arrest rate of Black people for suspected drug use is quite a lot higher than the rate of drug use among Black people. So this mismatch also makes it the case that the comparative arrest rate, which compares the rest of a rate for Black people with that for non-Black people, doesn't track the comparative rate of drug use, comparing the rates of drug use among these two people. Okay. So if there is a mismatch, if there is a disconnect between the comparative arrest rate and the comparative rate of drug use, then any judgment about the comparative likelihood of drug use would potentially be consistent with the comparative arrest rate. After all, the comparative arrest rate may not be indicative of any particular state of affairs about drug use. And therefore, it seems to me that under these circumstances, again, when the comparative arrest rate does not track the comparative rate of drug use, the claim that a judgment reflects the comparative arrest rate would be mystifying. I'm not able to ascribe to this claim any meaning whatsoever. And in fact, the assumption that the comparative arrest rate tracks the comparative rate of drug use cannot possibly apply in a criminal justice system such as the US or the English and Welsh. And this is precisely because arrest rates are partly driven in this system by racism in law enforcement. Now, I'm much more familiar with the data about England and Wales than those about the US, and I'm simplifying the data a bit here, but it is well known that Black people are wildly overrepresented in the population of those arrested. And what's more significant, Black people are more likely to be arrested, notwithstanding that they're less likely to commit crime. So definitely the comparative arrest rate does not track the comparative rate of drug use, and therefore the claim that judgment about the comparative likelihood of drug use tracks the comparative arrest rate, to me, means very little, if anything at all. So I restate what I said earlier. My point is not that the single factor view is, necessarily correct or correct. My point is that Kathy's example doesn't contribute to show that it's not. And notice instead that if the stereotype concerning the comparative rate of drug use among the Black and non-Black populations actually reflected the comparative arrest rate, due to the fact that the comparative arrest rate actually tracks the comparative rate of drug use, then it seems to me that it would be perfectly sensible to argue that reliance on such a stereotype increases the chances of judging accurately, say, whether a Black acquaintance is more or less likely to use drugs than a non-Black acquaintance. And this is because that judgment would indeed reflect the statistical reality about drug use. So if indeed the stereotype reflects the comparative arrest rate, then it seems to me that the single factor view has it right in this particular case. My third point, my third point has to do with Kathy's fascinating discussion of the epistemic and ethical demands involved in the case of stereotyping and of the relationship between these. Now, in this discussion, Kathy criticizes the moral encroachment approach to stereotyping. Okay, so I'm just going to assess quickly this criticism. Thanks for the reminder. I'll definitely make it within 10 minutes. So the essential claim of moral encroachment is that whether someone knows that P depends on the moral stakes of the decision problem, right? This is a presentation of the moral encroachment approach to stereotyping, in which I quote from Kathy. According to this approach, ethical and epistemic demands do not conflict because moral considerations determine whether it is epistemically permissible to engage in stereotyping. Where there are high moral stakes in a situation in which a judgment is made, high evidentiary standards need to be met in order for a judgment to be justified or rational or to constitute knowledge. In cases where people might engage in stereotyping, there will often be high moral stakes. These stakes will raise the evidentiary standards. Those who engage in stereotyping will not meet the high evidentiary standards. Therefore, stereotyping will not be justified or rational. In other words, according to this reconstruction of the moral encroachment approach to stereotyping, stereotyping often occurs in cases with high moral stakes. If there are high moral stakes, the evidentiary standards are also high, and stereotyping does not allow to meet those evidentiary standards. Therefore, it's, well, impermissible and also epistemically unwarranted. So Kathy criticizes the moral encroachment approach on more than one ground, but there's one in particular that I'm interested in. She claims that the approach mistakenly assumes that stereotyping is never justified in high-stakes situations. And the quote starts here. Sometimes high-stakes situations demand stereotyping because stereotyping can be an efficient way to achieve both ethical and epistemic goals, like correct diagnosis and treatment decisions. I think Kathy is right here in saying that high-stakes situations sometimes might justify stereotyping. Where I think she's wrong is that in claiming that the moral encroachment approach doesn't allow for this. Why do I say that? So my claim is moral encroachment may well justify stereotyping in situations with high moral stakes. And I'll give an example of that. Take as an example a decision whether to diagnose a medical condition, where the false negative, so failing to diagnose the condition when the patient actually has the condition, the false negative is very costly. Let's say that the patient will die if the condition is not diagnosed and they actually have the condition. The false positive instead, so diagnosing the condition when the patient does not have the condition, is only moderately costly. The patient will suffer moderate side effects of the treatment if the condition is diagnosed and they actually do not have the condition. It seems to me that given such a value function, and of course this is just a partial value function because I only mentioned the false outcomes, but given such a value function for the possible outcomes of the decision problem, the evidentiary threshold for knowing that the patient has the condition, that is, for being justified in acting as if the patient had the condition, would be relatively low. In other words, given this value function, I would be justified, if I were the doctor, in diagnosing the condition, even if only a relatively low evidentiary threshold has been met. And this is because what matters most to me, assuming that I am a moral agent, is to avoid a false negative. So is to avoid not diagnosing the condition when the patient actually has the condition. So it seems to me that this is a situation with high moral stakes. Check out the value of the false negative, in which moral encroachment may well justify stereotyping. Stereotyping might not allow for a high evidentiary threshold to be met, but insofar as this threshold does not need to be high, then stereotyping might be fit for the job. My very last point has to do with Kathy's theory of evaluative dispositionalism, which she has presented in her introduction. So I don't have to say much by way of presenting the theory. It's discussed in chapter 8. It's a combination of existing accounts of epistemic appraisal. And it states that a complete epistemic evaluation of an act of believing should focus on both A, the dispositions that are displayed in believing, and B, the dispositions that are possessed due to believing. So A could be, all the dispositions that are apparent in the formation of a belief. So it could be dispositions towards the evidence, or it could be whether the belief is coherent with other beliefs that the agent has. And the static and upstream accounts focus on A exclusively, whereas B has to do, in particular, not exclusively, but with the epistemic pitfalls that Kathy has mentioned just discussed in chapter 3. And a downstream account would exclusively be focused on B. So evaluative dispositionalism combines these accounts. Now, to give an illustration of how this works, and it's one of the several, so I don't mean to say that this is the only illustration that Kathy gives. She mentions a hypothetical in which two individuals harbor the same stereotyping belief, and yet, according to her, this belief deserves different epistemic evaluation in the two cases, due to B. So it's only in one of the two cases that the stereotyping belief leads to the epistemic pitfalls, and therefore it's only in that case that holding the stereotyping belief is epistemically unwarranted. So what is this example? We go back again to our stereotype about scientific expertise. So we have Nora and Ned, who hold the stereotyping belief that men are more likely than women to have scientific expertise. We know the belief is accurate, at least if referred to a society such as the English and Welsh or the UK, perhaps the US as well. And it's formed on the basis of the same evidence for Nora and Ned. So up to this point, there would be no reason to consider it justified for Nora and not for Ned, or the other way around, okay? However, then we are told something important about some pre-existing dispositions or some commitments that Nora and Ned have. So Nora, but not Ned, is a feminist. And as a result, Kathy says, only Ned incurs epistemic pitfalls when judging the expertise of a woman scientist. So Nora doesn't. She endorses that stereotype, but she doesn't because, being a feminist, she's particularly careful in, say, not disregarding evidence of the woman's expertise, not downplaying this evidence, not misinterpreting this evidence, not incurring in testimonial injustice against this woman, and so on and so forth. Okay. So the conclusion here is that on the evaluative dispositional account, the characters and their active believing deserve different epistemic evaluations. And Kathy's also told us now that actually perhaps we have an intuition that this is correct, that the two individuals who hold the same stereotype might actually be sort of the target of different degrees of criticism. But my query, because it's more of a query than it is actually a claim here, I should say, is whether this is the correct evaluative dispositionalist stance on the example of Nora and Ned. And of course, evaluative dispositionalism is not my theory, it's Kathy's theory, so obviously she would know better than me what is the correct stance here. But I just want to make a contribution in the hope that it might help improving the theory. Perhaps it doesn't. So evaluative dispositionalism says that downstream dispositions, such as the epistemic pitfalls following an act of believing, affect the justification of believing if they are possessed due to believing, right? Now, in the case of Nora and Ned, the pitfalls are not just due to the stereotyping belief. Otherwise, they would both incur them. So we have two possibilities. Either the stereotyping belief is entirely irrelevant, such that the pitfalls are entirely due to pre-existing dispositions, say the rejection of feminism for Ned, or perhaps the stereotyping belief is not irrelevant. It has a causal role to play, but surely is not the only cause of the pitfalls. Otherwise, both Nora and Ned would incur the pitfalls. Okay, so if the fact that Ned holds the stereotyping belief is indeed irrelevant to the occurrence of the pitfalls, this being entirely brought about by pre-existing dispositions such as the rejection of feminism, then there is no reason to accept that these pitfalls should be factored into the assessment of the justification of holding such belief. And in fact, evaluative dispositionalism says that they shouldn't. Okay. But Ned's holding the belief may not be relevant after all. For instance, it may act as an enabler or as an enhancer of the pre-existing dispositions. So maybe it is a cause, but these dispositions are a cause as well. Or maybe it actually isn't a cause. It's merely something that enhances a pre-existing cause, enhances the effect of the pre-existing cause. So in this example, perhaps there's a causal story to be told, the complexity of which seems to be unaccounted for in the current formulation of evaluative dispositionalism, that only talks about pitfalls being possessed or dispositions being possessed due to believing. So here is the constructive part. I wonder whether evaluative dispositionalism wouldn't be improved by answering this question. How significant should be the causal or enhancing role of the belief for the pitfalls to be factored into the assessment of the justification of holding this belief? So given the current formulation, it would seem that any causal or enhancing role would do. But I think there are reasons to doubt that this is correct. So take a stereotyping belief that is accurate, such as the one that we are relying on in this example. And now imagine that this stereotyping belief only plays a minimal role in bringing about the pitfalls. Let's say it's not a cause at all. It just enhances the causal impact of the pitfalls. It makes them just a bit more effective. Sorry, of the pitfalls of the pre-existing dispositions. It makes this pre-existing disposition just a bit more effective in causing the pitfalls. Now, I don't think in this case it would be warranted to conclude that the belief is epistemically unwarranted. Okay. And I'm going to stop here. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Federico. It was very clear, I think, your points. So now it's Jennifer's turn. Jennifer, I think you should need to activate your microphone.
Can you hear me now? Okay, I kept hitting the unmute button and
Yes.
It just didn't respond properly. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, it's okay, it's working.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me and for the chance to talk about this book. I really loved reading this book because it's one of my favorite kinds of books in that it's like incredibly carefully argued with lots and lots of very sensible claims and arguments and lots of data, and yet it leads to a really surprising and weird seeming conclusion. And I love that sort of book. So I really enjoyed engaging with it. What I'm going to be suggesting is actually perhaps an even stranger conclusion that I think that Kathy's arguments could support, that I think would be interesting and worth thinking about. So in a way, this isn't so much criticism as building on and asking further questions. Okay.
Sorry, Jenny, can you just put the screen like a bigger, because it's like very small. We can't.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
we see all
yeah.
the screen and not Yes,
That's what
great.
you want.
And thank
That's
you.
great. Thank you for telling me early. I appreciate that. Okay, so the startling conclusions that I'm interested in from this book are that social attitudes which don't reflect reality can sometimes be epistemically good, and also that acts of truthful stereotyping can sometimes be epistemically bad. And these both sound really surprising and weird when you pull them out and look at them like that. But Kathy makes them seem really sensible. And her argument depends crucially on the idea that the first claim here is true because the second claim is true. So the reason that sometimes it's good to have a social attitude that doesn't reflect reality is simply that reflecting reality can sometimes lead you astray. Okay, so I'm going to briefly mention Kathy's definition of stereotypes because I think it's a little bit counterintuitive. I think that's okay. Her goal isn't to reflect ordinary usage, but I just want to call attention to it. So stereotype is a social attitude that associates members of some social group more strongly than others with a certain trait or traits. And the reason I find this a little counterintuitive is because it doesn't take all that much for something to be a stereotype. So take the social group people who teach at Durham University, which is in the north of England. Well, I associate this social group more strongly than lots of others with teaching in the north of England. But it seems strange to conclude from that I am thereby stereotyping the people who teach at Durham University. However, this is a consequence of Kathy's view. And as I said, I don't think it matters that it's counterintuitive. I thought I'd just mention that since we're going to be talking about stereotypes. Okay. So now I want to turn to Kathy's argument for the surprising claims that I mentioned. And you might be wondering why I have this slide here. The reason I have this slide is because the AI trapped in my PowerPoint application suggested this image for this title. And I thought it was a hilarious and adorable suggestion. So I went with it, even though I have no idea why I made that suggestion. And it's always reassuring to see the AIs doing really weird things. Okay, so Kathy's view, epistemic dispositionalism, what we should do is we should examine the dispositions that give rise to a belief and the dispositions that flow from it in order to assess those beliefs, those beliefs. And you need to look for both the flaws and the benefits. So she argues the approach provides clear prescriptions about how to approach acts of believing stereotypes. Check the dispositions associated with so believing. It allows us to distinguish satisfactorily between two different acts of stereotyping and explaining, for example, how two people can believe the same stereotype under the same circumstances and yet be deserving of different levels of praise and criticism. So the kinds of things that you should think about when you're epistemically evaluating a belief are these. Does the stereotype dispose the person who applies it to respond in a way that is fitting with accurate statistical information? Does the application of the stereotype lead information about the specific case to be distorted or ignored? For instance, does the application of the stereotype lead to distorted remembering, the misinterpretation of ambiguous evidence, false assumptions about similarities or dissimilarities among groups and group members, aspects of the social identity of the person who is stereotyped being missed, testimonial silencing, or testimonial injustice? And this is where I'm going along thinking this is all incredibly sensible. How am I going to have anything at all to say about this? So here's a key example for Kathy of how truthful stereotyping can be epistemically bad. Take the belief that men are more likely than women to be scientists. This is true belief, but it can lead to bad epistemic effects when evaluating a job candidate because holding these stereotypes can cause you to not properly appreciate the accomplishments of a woman candidate, for example. Because of that, false beliefs like that men and women are equally likely to be scientists can be good because that makes you not likely to make those particular mistakes. So consider Albert. Albert believes that women and men are equally likely to be scientists. And because he has this false belief, it saves him from errors when he's looking through the applications of women and men. He doesn't have any expectation that the women are less likely to be scientists, so he's not stereotyping them. He's evaluating their contributions appropriately. He's appreciating what's new and original and impressive about what they're doing. He's not misremembering what women have done. He's not misattributing things to men. He's a much fairer evaluator of women's work because of this. So because of that, Kathy says that belief is epistemically innocent, that belief of Albert's. A cognition is epistemically innocent if there is no alternative cognition that would confer the same benefit without the costs. So assuming that there's no other belief Albert could hold which would confer those benefits for him, this is an epistemically innocent belief. Now, I think building on this picture that Kathy should actually come to a much more radical conclusion than the one that she argues for. I think that if you take this picture very seriously, then you end up with the idea that you should give up on epistemically assessing individual beliefs or stereotypes themselves. You can assess their truth or falsehood, but you can't, epistemically assess them in any other ways. So if what you're concerned with is all of the dispositions that give rise to and flow from the beliefs and stereotypes, it becomes impossible to pull those beliefs or stereotypes out individually and assess them. That's what I'm going to be arguing. Okay, so there are two lines of argument that I use for this. One is what I call the very many dispositions argument, and the other is the which cognition argument. So the basic idea of the very many dispositions argument is that any act of stereotyping or believing something is going to give range to a huge range of dispositions, depending on what circumstances somebody might possibly find themselves in. And there's going to be such a huge range of these available, all of these dispositions that could flow from that belief, that do flow from it, because that's how dispositions work, that we can never reach a firm evaluation of the stereotype or belief. Okay, so let's go back to Albert. As I said, when he's making a series of hiring decisions, his false beliefs do epistemic good. They help him to make more accurate judgments. But now imagine that Albert has some power to make funding decisions, and he's asked to allocate some funds for a study on the underrepresentation of women in science. Well, his reaction will be, what are you talking about? Women aren't underrepresented in science. There are equal numbers of women and men in science. This is ridiculous. Why would you study that? And he'll refuse to fund it. So that leads him to a bad, unjustified judgment, and a bad decision, and one that will lead to fewer truths being uncovered. It'll be bad for science and bad for epistemology that this study doesn't get funded. It's also just simply an error that he's making. So that's one thing that could happen. He is disposed, if asked to fund a study on the underrepresentation of women in science, to say no. But he might also, he might be making hiring decisions. He might be deciding about funding a project on the underrepresentation of women, or he might leave science and become a bartender, and then his false belief isn't really involved in anything interesting. And if you're going to talk about his dispositions, that's going to include all of those and so much more. So some of them bad, some of them good, some of them neutral epistemically. And there's no clear guidance of what to focus on if what we're supposed to do is think about all of his dispositions. So that leads me to think we can't really make any clear judgment of his false belief, the epistemic merits of that false belief, because there are just too many dispositions to look at. Okay, so now I want to turn to the which cognition issue, which I think ties in to Federico's last worry, but builds on it in quite a different way and takes it in a different direction.
So the thought is no cognition acts on its own to give rise to dispositions. What dispositions a person has is going to be determined not just by that one cognition, but by everything else surrounding it. So any act of believing or act of stereotyping is going to be carried out by a person who has lots of other beliefs, lots of other dispositions, lots of habits and skills and preferences, and so on and so forth. And all of those are going to matter a lot to what dispositions that person has. And this makes for problems with assessing, pulling out an act of believing or an act of stereotyping and thinking that you could just assess it on the basis of what dispositions it gives rise to when so much else is involved. So I'll give a few examples to motivate this. Okay, take Betty and Carla. Betty and Carla both believe that men are more likely than women to be scientists. And as a result of this, they both have lots of epistemically problematic dispositions. Even though they're women, they're disposed to make all kinds of stereotypical judgments of women when they encounter women scientists' CVs, for example. And they're disposed to fail to properly appreciate the contributions of women and to misremember what women have said and to think that a woman's any problems in a woman's presentation are due to her not understanding properly rather than to her being affected by something else as they would with a man, and so on and so forth. One day, Betty and Carla go to a really great workshop on implicit bias. And it explains implicit bias to them, talks about biases about women in science, and gives them lots of techniques and handouts for mitigating the influence of these biases. The great workshop, of course, is run by a great workshop leader. I wasn't sure if Kathy actually leads workshops on implicit bias, so I decided to put in a picture of Jules Holroyd here because I know she does. So they go to a great workshop. It's not just one of those run by the HR department. But they react differently to this great workshop. So Betty takes that wonderful handout that Jules made and she shreds it and decides to think no more about this. She wants to stick her head back in the sand and ignore this. Carla is horrified by what she's learned, takes the handbook, the handout home with her, studies it carefully, and takes lots of action to mitigate the influence of her implicit biases. So Betty goes on having the very bad epistemic dispositions, and Carla works hard not to have those, and she mitigates them. She ceases to have those bad epistemic dispositions because she's done so much. Now, it seems wrong, given they both had this disposition to start with, to just blame the disposition in Betty's case. Since the dispositions, it seems wrong to blame the belief that women are underrepresented in science, even in Betty's case, because the dispositions, those bad dispositions, result from that belief and everything else, like her refusal to learn anything from the implicit bias workshop, whereas Carla has that same belief, but does a lot of work to mitigate things and ends up without the bad epistemic dispositions. So this seems like an odd thing to single out that belief. And Kathy would admit that. She says these two cases deserve different judgments. One advantage that she cites for evaluative dispositionalism is the ability to explain how two people with the same stereotype believed under the same circumstances may deserve different levels of praise and blame. But for Kathy, those different levels of praise and blame attach to the act of believing the stereotype. My question here is that whether that's really what we should be attaching the praise and blame to, or whether it attaches to a whole bunch of other stuff instead. So now let's take one more example. So this is Dorinda. And Dorinda is a woman in science. I want to mention that except for the picture of Jules Holroyd, all of these other people are just fictional images well, they're not fictional, they're stock photos. So this is Dorinda. She's a woman in science, and she's very aware of the underrepresentation of women. And she's aware of the barriers that women face in succeeding in science, and all, you know, that it's much harder for a woman to succeed in science in general than for a man to succeed in science. And she's determined to take this into account and to help however she can to overcome these problems for women in science. So she adopts the policy of thinking, okay, if I have two CVs that are equally impressive from a woman and a man, I will assume that the woman is more deserving and more impressive than the man, because it would be harder for her to achieve these things. The woman, after all, has had to overcome all of these barriers to success in science that women face. And the man, Dorinda thinks, won't have had those barriers. So I'll just adopt the policy of always preferring the woman to the man, which is a policy that's sometimes recommended. But now take Edith. Edith is also a woman scientist, and she's with Dorinda up to a point, but she is aware of more than that. She also considers race and the disadvantages that some men may face due to their race. As a result of that, her calculation is more complicated. She doesn't just say, this is a man, so it's less impressive, he won't have faced barriers. She also wants to look at, for example, whether that's a Black man whose CV she's seeing. So as it turns out, because Dorinda doesn't take race into account, her belief in women's underrepresentation results in dispositions that make her unfair to Black men. She sees them as having faced no barriers because they're men. Edith has the same belief in women's underrepresentation, but she doesn't end up with dispositions that make her unfair to Black men because she doesn't adopt the same policy that Dorinda does. She's also thinking about race in addition to thinking about gender. Now, in trying to judge what's going on here, it seems strange to focus on the belief about women's underrepresentation and say that belief is blameworthy. In Dorinda's case, it has these bad effects. We can make an epistemically negative judgment on that belief. And it doesn't have those bad effects in Edith's case. Well, that's true, but it doesn't seem as informative as thinking about all of the other stuff. And in fact, it seems kind of odd. I mean, I said it's true, but it doesn't actually seem so plausible to judge that belief to think that we should be judging that belief. It seems like what we should be doing is judging a much more complex collection of things, which isn't just pulling out that one belief and making a judgment, but looking at that belief and how it's situated in the context of a whole bunch of other stuff and seeing what results from that. So to sum up, the very many dispositions worry makes me wonder how it's possible to apply the evaluative dispositionalist framework. How you can ever make a confident judgment about whether someone's dispositions are on balance good or bad. There's, so many situations a person could find themselves in. And if you have to think through all of those, I mean, you'll never get done. But it just makes it much more complex to try to come to any kind of judgment. The which cognition worry makes me wonder whether you should even try to single out a particular cognition for evaluation, when what matters is that cognition in the whole context of a person and all of their other beliefs and attitudes and predispositions and desires and priorities, and whether that's what should be evaluated instead rather than the individual cognition. So all of this leads me to the thought that if you take Kathy's arguments seriously, which I think we really should, I think they're really interesting, important arguments, then you could end up in an even more surprising place where you can't actually assess the epistemic worth of any individual belief or stereotype at all. And that brings me to the end.
Thank you, Jennifer. I forgot to introduce you. Probably you know her. Well, you are like a professor of philosophy at the University of Waterloo in Canada and University of Sheffield in the UK. So thank you very much. It was very colorful, your presentation, and very clear. So now it's time for Federico Arena. So I will not forget to introduce this time. So Federico Arena is a researcher at the CONICET in Argentina, and I think you also work at the Universidad Nacional de Córdoba. Córdoba is not in Buenos Aires for the people who doesn't know, so it's like far away. So Federico, it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. I will also like to start by thanking Marina for organizing this workshop, and to Katy for giving us the opportunity of discussing her ideas, and to both of you for taking the risk of having me here. And so thank you very much. I won't share the presentation, and given that with Federico we not only share our names but also some of the arguments, there is an overlap in there too. So I am going to skip some arguments that I have shared with you before, in order to make my presentation more interesting, I hope. So I would like to introduce in this discussion some kind of legal perspective. I am a legal philosopher, so I am very interested in what Kathy, if I may, make in her book, that is trying to give us a full theory or a more general perspective of how to assess the way in which stereotypes may increase or decrease our chances of making an accurate judgment on individuals. And that is a very important point for legal philosophers if we take into consideration the judge perspective. So the bearer of a stereotype that I have in mind is a judge that has to establish whether some element allows him to take some facts as real. Okay, so I'm thinking in this kind of subject that try to assess whether some fact has taken place in the past, on the basis of the legal proofs of the evidence present at the end of a legal process. And it is true that we legal theorists have been talking about stereotypes for a long time now, but we don't have, as I said, a general perspective or a general theory on how they might affect our legal reasoning, more precisely our reasoning on evidence. So I think that's one point that make Kathy books very interesting for legal scholars. So I am going to make 4 points. I am going to start. I know that we are here to talk about stereotypes, but I would like to make a methodological point. It is a little bit provocative, but I just want to know which is Kathy's answer to that point. So I'm going to start with that methodological point. And then I'm going to make other 3 more substantive points on Kathy's idea. The first point is, it may be introduced by a funny or wannabe funny story that we told between Genoa PhD student, that is this Argentinian analytic philosopher that is a very good friend of an Italian analytic philosopher. They both love wine, Italian wine and food, but they disagree on Italian bread. According to the Argentinian, the Italian bread is not good. So one day the Italian philosopher gives his friend a piece of bread without telling him which is the origin of this piece of bread. The Argentinian tasted it and said, "It is very good." So the Italian reacts, "Well, it is Italian." And then the Argentinian answer, "Then it is not bread." So it is just an example of what I might call the terminological move. And the first point is then, which is the status of the philosophical status of a terminological move. It seems to me that along the discussion of the debate between the normative and non-normative views on stereotype of definition of stereotypes, Kathy seems to give to the terminological move a philosophical status. That is, to give to the terminological move the status of a philosophical argument. Because at the end of the debate, during this debate, she analyzes several arguments in favor of the non-normative view, that is the view according to which we should not include in our definition of stereotype the fact that they are inaccurate, because stereotypes may be accurate, that is the non-normative view. In her assessment of the arguments in favor of the non-normative view, she says at some point that some of the arguments are not good arguments because they, the advocates of the normative view may still answer, that's okay. You may say that there are some kind of attitudes that are accurate, but those attitudes are not stereotypes. So in the sense, I can still use the term stereotypes in a way that I like. And it seems to me that an answer like that is just a surrender, like raising the white flag when you said, like the Argentinian philosopher, then it is not bread. I'm not going to use the term bread to make reference to that piece of food. Because in the discussion between the non-normative and the normative conception of stereotypes, we can put forward some arguments that may be considered philosophical arguments, like counterexamples, arguments from ordinary language intuitions, logical inconsistencies. But I don't see how this terminological move may count as a philosophical argument. For example, in the discussion, one argument is there are some stereotypes that are accurate. And then rightly, Kathy said, well, we can say that some of those, some attitudes that are accurate may not be stereotyped. But the point is that there are some attitudes that intuitively we will call stereotypes that are accurate. So to make the terminological move will mean to disregard those intuitions. That may be something that we had to do after a conceptual analysis, but we have to pay some price, and that is the philosophical argument. And there are other arguments, kind of arguments that may count as philosophical arguments, like the argument according to which if you say that stereotypes or attitudes that are accurate are not stereotypes, you may fall into a contradiction, because you will say that attitude that says that some group has certain characteristic and another attitude that says that that same group hasn't that characteristic are both false, and that would be a contradiction. And again, the point is that there are some attitudes that we will intuitively call stereotypes, that if they are both false, that would be a contradiction. Like attitudes, for example, all Americans are obese, that's a stereotype, and all Americans are fitness crazy. So saying that both of them are false may produce contradiction. So we can say that all stereotypes are false. And those are intuitive examples of stereotypes. So that, which I would like to point out with this first methodological issue is, well, what do you think, Kathy, is the status of the terminological movement? Or what do you think about the philosophical method or conceptual analysis, how we could assess the success of a conceptual proposal? I think that the terminological move shouldn't count between those criteria. And then on the most substantive points, as Federico and Jennifer have already said, one point of Kathy's books is to defend a multi-factor view on how stereotype may affect our individual judgments. And in that, on that regard, she discusses the single factor view and the dual factor view. According to the single factor view, stereotypes may increase our chances of making accurate judgments, individual judgments, if they reflect some aspect of social reality. And the dual factor view makes that requirement more precise, saying that it's not only reflecting some aspect of social reality, but it is being accurate, that is fitting some statistical information, plus a condition regarding the information that we may gather regarding the individual. So we may take into consideration non-ambiguous individual information. So Kathy's point is not that these two views are mistaken, but that they are limited, that they are not a full assessment of the factor of what we need to take into consideration in order to assess stereotypes. So we need to add more factors. And she proposed several factors that may be grouped into three categories. She says on the first, statistic accuracy, then relevance, and then case-specific information. The first one, statistic accuracy, is an argument against the single factor view. I am not going to deal with this factor here because I am interested in showing that, according to me at least, the dual factor view may make space to all these factors pointed out by Kathy, may offer us the instruments needed to take into consideration all those factors in order to assess acts of stereotyping. I may like to clarify at the beginning that I agree with Kathy with this sort of what I may call discomfort with the dual factor view, that we need to say something more about stereotypes in order to have a full view of their effects on our reasoning. But I think that all these factors that it's pointed out by Kathy may be accommodated by the dual factor view. And this discomfort with the dual factor view is relevant within legal scholars, because within most legal orders, there is an obligation of avoid gender stereotypes. Now, after the convention against all forms of discrimination for the elimination of all form of discrimination against women, state parties has the duty of eliminate of all sort of gender stereotypes. So this is a legal obligation. So a judge who has to decide whether some element of proof allow him to take a fact as verified should avoid in his reasoning the gender stereotypes. That is a legal obligation, and that's why, if I may make a note on my previous observation, that is why the terminological move will be a sort of a strange move, because the judge could say, okay, I base my reasoning on an attitude regarding some group, but that attitude is accurate, so that's not a stereotype. I am not violating the convention. So that's another reason why the terminological move is suspect to me. So we have this legal obligation and of avoiding stereotypes, and one criteria that is between legal scholar, one criteria that is wide shared between legal scholar is that we may assess stereotypes on the basis of their accuracy, their statistical accuracy. So let's take an example of a case in Argentina that I mentioned in the notes that I shared previously, is the case of the norm that established that federal judges should retire at the age of 75. So that norm, according to the Supreme Court, is based on a generalization according to which judges older than 70 are prone to lose some capacities needed to deliver justice. So the Supreme Court of Argentina, in a famous case, considered that generalization as accurate, as fitting some statistical information. So one point of Kathy is that even if this generalization is accurate, we may have it may in some cases produce some epistemic cost, because we have to take into consideration not only the fact that it is accurate, but other factors, such as I said, relevance and case-specific information. Now, the first point, I thank Federico, but because he didn't raise it, is this point on relevance, so that we do not overlap in this presentation. One point of Kathy is then that we may be aware that sometimes we use stereotypes even if they are not relevant. And she gives us some explanation, psychological explanation, on why we are prone to do that, to use stereotypes even if they are not relevant. That is because we may want to protect a wounded ego, or the desire to justify the current social system. And she said that the dual factor view doesn't take into consideration this second factor, the relevance of stereotypes, at least in the way as I have read Kathy's arguments. So we are prone to use stereotypes, accurate stereotypes, even if they are irrelevant. So my point here is that to ask Kathy to precise the definition of relevance, that in the way that she uses this term in her book, because it seems to me that the cases that she uses to prove that we may use stereotypes that are irrelevant, even if accurate, are different. So the sense in which the stereotypes are not relevant in those cases are, at least seems to me, they are different. So it is not easy to grasp the argument regarding the irrelevance of stereotypes. And it is important to precise the definition of relevance, because otherwise we may say that according to the dual factor view, we may use stereotypes only if relevant. So the dual factor view is when say that we can use stereotypes, or stereotypes increase our chances of making accurate individual judgments if they fit statistic information. It seems to me that within that definition of that criterion, it is also that of relevance, in the sense that to say that a stereotype increase our chances of making an accurate judgment, it may be applied, it must be applied to a case that falls within the scope of the attitude of the stereotype. So to say that the stereotype or the generalization according to which judges of certain age start to lose some capacities, increases the chances of making an accurate judgment regarding a particular judge, regarding a particular individual. That individual must be a judge in order to the judgment to be to increase the stereotype, to increase our chances of making an accurate judgment. So it seems to me that if that is the sense of relevance, it is included in the dual factor view. The third point is what I might call the epistemic import of egalitarian attitudes. That point has been raised by Federico. I will just like to add some considerations regarding the way in which Kathy advocates for the view according to which, in some cases, having egalitarian attitudes that do not reflect some aspect of social reality may increase our chances of making accurate judgments. I know that under Kathy's definition of stereotypes, egalitarian attitudes are not stereotypes because of the comparative element that Kathy introduces in the definition, but it seems to me that they are nevertheless generalizations. So applying an egalitarian attitude is also applying a generalization. So, and why this is important? Because it seems to me that all the flaws that the application of stereotyping produces are maybe not all of them, but most part of them are consequences of the fact of a stereotype being a generalization. So if I am in Kathy's example, Tim's is this man that grew up in an egalitarian society regarding the distribution of men and women into STEM disciplines, and then travels to UK where that is not the case, and he has an egalitarian attitude because he has grown up in an egalitarian society, but in the UK his attitude is false. Well, Kathy's argument is that having that egalitarian attitude, he will not only make virtuous interactions with female colleagues in UK, but he will also make more accurate individual judgments regarding the capacities or the qualities of those female colleagues. And I am not sure that having an egalitarian attitude is either necessary or sufficient to make accurate individual judgments. Because, for example, having, let's take the example of Argentina judges. If I if I am aware of the generalization of the stereotype according to which aged judges start to lose some capacities, then if I am in a meeting with an aged judge, and for example, a bottle is about to fall from the table and the judge managed to capture it before crashing into the floor, and during the same meeting, while she is talking with her guest, she doesn't notice that someone is knocking at her door. These are two events that take place during that meeting. If I am aware of the generalization of the stereotype, I will probably remember only the fact that she didn't notice the door knocking. That's one of the risk of having non-egalitarian stereotype or having stereotypes in general. So maybe, if I understood Kathy correctly, if I am aware of egalitarian attitude, I will remember instead the fact that she managed to capture the bottle before it crashed into the floor, because I won't have the idea that all people start to lose some capacities. But it seems to me that having an egalitarian attitude, and so applying a generalization according to which all people is not different from younger people regarding some capacities, will make me prone to remember only egalitarian facts, only facts that reflects the inexistence of a difference. But I will tend to ignore facts that reflect or may reflect the existence of a difference, as the fact that she didn't notice the door knocking. So having egalitarian attitude in non-egalitarian context may provoke some inaccurate judgments. Like if a UK physicist traveled to Tim's country and has an no, I'm sorry. And on the contrary, having non-egalitarian attitudes in some contexts may allow us to make accurate judgments, like the case of a UK physicist that travels to Tim's country, where the social reality is egalitarian, but he, by chance, meets a female colleague that has poor expertise on STEAM disciplines, and applying his non-egalitarian attitude or his stereotype, he will make an accurate judgment, even if the society is egalitarian. So it seems to me that on the one hand, I agree with Kathy that having egalitarian attitude is better for avoiding some form of discrimination, but it is not having egalitarian attitude what will allow us to avoid the pitfall of stereotyping. What I think will allow us to avoid those pitfalls is having an open mind, having the sensibility to adjust our attitudes to the information that the world gives us, to change what our belief in the face of information that doesn't fit our previous belief. That it's more an attitude and not the virtuosity of the content of our attitude or stereotype that will allow us to make accurate judgments. And just to finish, the last point, and this is more like a way of open the discussion to other issues, but I think that given the interesting work of Kathy on the additional factors that may affect our stereotyping, I would like to point out to another factor, what I might call a hidden factor, that is stereotype normativity. That the fact that some stereotypes are normative is something that has been claimed by several psychologists and also political theorists in the past. It's not something original, it is clear. But I think that the fact that some stereotypes might be normative may also have some effects on our assessment of individual characteristic. One example of a normative stereotype that is very common in legal context is, but there are many normative gender stereotypes in the legal content, but there is one that is very the judges use very often, that is how women should behave regarding their children, their son and their daughters. And for example, that they should give them a good, if they are single mothers, they should give a wealthy life, but they should also take care of them. So she should personally take care of them. So she should work in order to have money to give them a wealthy life, but she should also take care personally of them. That seems something impossible, and that is a normative stereotype in the sense that its direction of fit is not stereotype to war, but it is social war to stereotype direction of fit. It doesn't purports to describe social reality, but it purports to say women what they should do regarding how to grow their children. And even if they are not descriptive, even if they do not have this stereotype toward direction of fit, they may affect our assessment of individual characteristics, individual traits. And so I would also like to know what Kathy thinks about this stereotype normativity, because for example, something that people who study the effects of stereotypes in legal reasoning said is that normative stereotypes may produce a kind of inversion of the epistemic enterprise. That is to say, a judge who has these stereotypes regarding how women should raise their children may adjust the facts in order to punish the woman that do not fit, the woman that doesn't fit the stereotype. So normative stereotype produce this kind of inversion of the direction of an epistemic enterprise. It is not longer about knowing how the facts were, but it is about to adjusting our description of fact in order to be able to punish the woman that doesn't fit the stereotype. That is something that also happened in the context of crimes of violence against women, regarding women that do not fit some stereotypes regarding decent sexual behavior, etc., etc. So, well, those are my four points. Thanks again, and I leave the word to Leonie.
Thank you, Federico. It was very clear. Also, thank you for all this presentation. There are a lot of points like raising. So, Leonie, now it's your turn. I don't know what is your affiliation, because I put the University of Manchester, but it seems that you changed, right? You are not there anymore.
No, it is the University of Manchester. It was the University of Manchester, then it wasn't, now it is again. So
okay,
yeah.
okay. Because I also found like Cardiff, so it was okay.
Yeah.
Well,
accidentally correct. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and just want to say, as I'm at the last one, thank you again, Marina, for organising this and encouraging us to have the opportunity to comment on Catherine's wonderful book. I've very much enjoyed reading it. Coming at the end, I think that some of the things that I say, can everybody see my screen? Is that showing okay? It should just be. Some of the things I say I think reflected in some of the points that people have made. But just as a general point, in the book, I think that Catherine's just produced this honestly invaluable, very convincing to me, non-normative account of what stereotypes are and how the relationship between epistemic and ethical goals and the conditions in which we ought to be using stereotypes to achieve those goals is actually far more complex than perhaps people might have realized. And I just found myself, perhaps a bit like Jenny was saying, just agreeing with a lot of what was being said and just finding it so well put out that it was fantastic. So in what follows, I don't think that these are substantial worries for the overall account of what's going on. They're more just, I think, a few points to think about and maybe consider with regard to how this analysis fits with other accounts in the literature to do with epistemic ethics. And so specifically, I'm just going to focus on what Katherine says with regard to testimony and justice and some of the cases that she comes up with. And so the main points that I'll be looking at are around this claim that Katherine makes, that when credibility deficits occur involving accurate stereotypes, as she plausibly argues they do, there will sometimes be an absence of prejudice, and so the effect is not a case of testimony and justice because this occurs due to the operation of prejudice, which isn't happening in these cases. So that's kind of what I'm starting with. So just before we can have a look at Catherine's points on this, a reminder or a primer on testimony and justice might be worth covering, with apologies to people who've heard this so many times before, but just so we understand the account that Puddifoot is responding to here. In a case of testimony injustice, a person who's marginalized in the society might fail to be treated fairly through the unjust epistemic behaviors of the people that she interacts with. And one way that this can happen, as Katherine says, is through testimony injustice. So someone who experiences testimony injustice is wronged specifically in her capacity as a knower, says Miranda Fricker, when she attempts to take part in a testimonial exchange or when she attempts to offer up her own knowledge and testimony. And in the central cases, although there are lots of other cases that might not be considered central, according to this account, the hearer just fails to take up, believe, or otherwise appropriately epistemically process the testimony of the speaker when she otherwise ought to, if she was acting as Katherine suggests, on egalitarian grounds, because of her implicit or explicit acceptance of identity prejudicial stereotypes, which embody a prejudice against the speaker. So basically, a person says something, they're treated as less credible than they ought to be because of prejudice in the background, stereotypical views of the person who's listening to that speaker. And there might be various other things that come along with that. And so in Miranda Fricker's classic cases, so here's one of them, you have this thing happening. So Fricker's cases are from literary fiction. This one's from the screenplay of The Talented Mr. Ripley. A woman, Marge Sherwood, is providing very credible, very important, valuable evidence about her perspective on what's happened to her missing partner. And she's providing this evidence to a male acquaintance, Herbert Greenleaf, who is somebody who is also her father-in-law because he's the dad of the person who's missing, and he otherwise holds Marge Sherwood in very high personal regard. And this is all happening in several decades back in a more sexist society, let's say. And what happens is that Marge Sherwood experiences a kind of subconscious downgrading of her testimony on the part of Greenleaf. He's not doing it intentionally to hurt her, but he does it because of prejudices that he holds, embodied in stereotypes that he holds towards people who are women in society at that point in time. So you can see this in the following interaction. Fricker suggests there's Greenleaf speaking to Tom Ridley, who was actually, was huge spoiler, but I think the book and the play have been out long enough. He's the murderer. This theory, the letter he left for you, the police think that's a clear indication he was planning on doing something to himself. Marge Sherwood attempts to interject. I just don't believe that. She's immediately dismissed by Greenleaf. You don't want to, dear. I'd like to talk to Tom alone, perhaps this afternoon. Would you mind? Marge, what a man may say to his sweetheart and what he'll admit to another fellow. And he just kind of leaves it hanging. But the implication is that Marge Sherwood is being completely irrational. She's being emotional. She's acting on feminine intuition, which is not akin to actual evidence or something worth paying attention to. And this is despite her having very valuable testimony to provide. So in this kind of case, and there's been various discussions of that case and criticisms of it and other cases we might have, but importantly, it brings out a number of features of what's going on in testimony and justice for Fricker's account. The speaker is a member of a group about which there are widely held stereotypes in the society. These stereotypes are explicitly negatively balanced, so they ascribe negative traits to the group in some way. In this case, it might be, and I'll come back to this, it might be the stereotype that women are not as rational as men, for example. These stereotypes embody prejudice in some way because they are resistant to counter evidence owing to some effective investment on the part of the subject. So the stereotype stands up despite there being evidence that perhaps what it's grounded on isn't well evidenced. And the hero is influenced, knowingly or otherwise, by these stereotypes in assessing the testimony they've been provided with, which leads to the poor, epistemically culpable treatment of the speaker's testimony in a specific interaction. And again, there are other variations on this, but this is what happens in that case and what happens in the paradigm cases. And that will be relevant to what I suggest in relation to Katherine's points in a moment. So what this might suggest is that there's something wrong with the stereotypes in play in cases of testimonial injustice. And when we think there's something wrong with them, we might be thinking it means that there's something inaccurate
about those stereotypes. And so the use of these faulty stereotypes makes the hearer epistemically culpable for failing to treat the speaker appropriately. But as Katherine brilliantly draws our attention to, there are lots of potentially lots of very important cases that appear to mirror the outcomes for the speaker, so the epistemic harm or unfair treatment, maybe, although using the word unfair is loaded, but certainly the harm or the impact of not being treated with the credibility that she ought to be, and the ethical harms that you might think are attached to that of testimony and justice, despite the hearer acting in ways which Katherine suggests don't appear to be epistemically or ethically suspect, because they are relying on accurate stereotypes, not false stereotypes. So in the case that has come up a few times in today's discussion, it might be the case that in wider society, women are less likely to have scientific expertise than men are. This itself could be due to any number of reasons, could be lack of opportunity, could be discriminatory treatment, education, and so on. But regardless of the reasons, the stereotype itself is accurate. It reflects some aspect of social reality, says Katherine. And in such a situation, something which is actually reflecting social reality accurately can still lead to the undue dismissal of the testimony of members of some social groups. So in the case of the woman working in science, a woman who's working in a STEM profession then tries to give her expertise, but her credibility is unfairly downgraded because the people around her hold the concept of the accurate stereotype that women are less likely to have scientific expertise than men. This is despite the fact that she actually is clearly a qualified individual because she's working in the profession. So she might be overlooked and ignored by her colleagues or in providing information to a wider public. And so what Katherine draws attention to is that here the speaker appears to experience the epistemic harm of not being treated fairly as a knower, we might think, in that she's not having her testimony treated as it ought to be, with all the attendant harms that might bring about. But the stereotype is, as Katherine says, it accurately reflecting some aspect of social reality in some way. It seems to be gained in an epistemically appropriate way. It's responsive to evidence. It's based on observation of facts about society. And so Katherine suggests that its use doesn't involve prejudice in the way that a false stereotype, an inaccurate stereotype might. And so it doesn't look like a testimonial injustice has taken place despite the unfair credibility deficit. And importantly, this suggests perhaps that the person who's listening to the speaker isn't responsible for the epistemic failure that's gone on, despite the fact that somebody is clearly experiencing a downgrading of credibility in a specific interaction. So I think that just actually drawing attention to these kinds of cases is a hugely important contribution to understanding the landscape of epistemic harm, because it seems just vital to me for anyone who's concerned with epistemic justice or just avoiding epistemic harm, if you think it's not injustice in structural oppression, for example, ought to be trying to recognize that in many ordinary cases of testimony interaction, the mechanism by which our epistemic judgments and the acts that follow from them can cause harm isn't immediately obvious through the presence of just false identity-based beliefs, which might be the impression that we get if we think about testimony and justice in the traditional cases. But I think that there are some worries, as no doubt Katherine also would think, to do with this fact. So one upshot of identifying these kinds of cases is that it becomes harder to recognize, without understanding the complicated and wide-ranging dispositions of the actors involved and all of the ways that might play out, whether the use of stereotypes as heuristics, or specific stereotypes or heuristic, will lead or might have led to epistemic harm in our own testimonial interactions. So if it is indeed the case that accurate and fairly or reasonably justifiably formed stereotypes can cause us to epistemically harm speakers in ways that we are not actually necessarily easily able to identify in some cases, because they also look like cases where it was fine for us to use that stereotype, then it becomes very difficult to argue that an ethical harm has taken place on the part of the hearer, despite there being someone who appears to be suffering in some way from that specific interaction. And while we can, of course, point to evaluative dispositionalism, as Katherine suggests, as a way to determine whether or not the person ought to adopt and use the heuristic or not. So the weighing up and the balance of all the possible up and downstream and sort of static aspects of their dispositions might suggest they acted in a reasonable way, or it might not. But given that these evaluations, I take it, are to do with the use of this stereotype in multiple different situations, it may well be that balance comes out saying, yeah, they didn't do anything ethically wrong here in the balance of the epistemic costs and benefits and what they should have weighed up and the dispositions they actually had to treat this evidence in an appropriate way. And this wouldn't necessarily then leave any real recourse for pointing out what seems to be, I think, to me at least, an ethical, epistemically culpable harm in a specific instance where the stereotypes applied by the hearer and leads to negative outcomes for the speaker. And I have the worry, I think, and some others might too, that it seems to let those who downgrade credibility in this way off the hook for what intuitively to some might still seem to be bad behavior. And I'm going to try and explain what bad behavior might be in and of itself, or the very least to suggest there's no ethical injustice. And it might also just make it very hard for us to identify whether a situation was one in which testimony injustice took place, whether an injustice took place or not. So we could just accept this. We could just bite the bullet on all of this and say, look, there was no specific ethical wrong, although somebody had some negative epistemic outcomes from this and further things. Actually, the person who was listening to them, they didn't do anything wrong in the balance here. But I think that might be premature, and I just wonder whether, although Katherine thinks these cases don't fall under the heading of ordinary testimony injustice, whether perhaps they might, which would make it then just fairly straightforward to say they count as examples of testimony injustice, and so we can see a wrongdoer and a wrong act of testimony injustice. So I'm just going to cover two possible ways this might be true. So the first way that I'm going to look at is going to suggest that perhaps these cases, contra Katherine, do actually involve the operation of prejudice. And so they should still be categorized on that grounds alone. But the second sort of worry or way of looking at it that I think is relevant is more that yes, they might still involve some operation of prejudice, but actually these cases might not actually be significantly different to ordinary cases of testimony injustice in terms of the role of stereotypes and how they're working. Okay, so that's basically what I'm going to look at next. So the first thing then I want to talk about is the way in which prejudice might be playing a part in these cases. So testimony injustice relies on the use of stereotypes which embody prejudice. That word can mean a number of different things. Fricke does have a very specific meaning for it, but it could be interpreted in different ways. So the first thing we might question is just whether there really is no prejudicial content involved in the use of the stereotype in the kinds of cases that Katherine is proposing. So applying a stereotype inappropriately without appropriate contextual boundaries as a result of some ethically bad effective investment on the part of the hearer, I would think involves prejudicial treatment. So let me just put this up in the case of women's STEM. So for Miranda Fricke, it seems like the specific stereotype itself has to embody a negative association, which is resistant to counter evidence, i.e. false. So it seems like in the classic cases, she wants to place the positioning of the resistance to counter evidence within the stereotype itself. The stereotype itself needs to be resistant to counter evidence in that it's not accurately reflecting reality in Katherine's language. And so for any case of testimonial harm, where the stereotype is not inaccurate, given the available evidence, and where the individual hearer would update their stereotype should the underlying facts change. It seems like prejudice hasn't played a part in the hearer's action, where their downgrading of the speaker's credibility is due to their belief in that accurate stereotype. But what's not clear to me, however, is that we ought to think that that's the place that these this failure to respond appropriate to evidence comes in when it comes to using stereotypes in our judgments. So it's not clear to me that testimonial injustice ought to only involve instances where the resistance to counter evidence is within the stereotype itself, rather than within the context in which one uses the stereotype. So prejudice can, I think, enter into our actions at lots of points. And this could still be directly connected to that stereotype, but not in virtue of being in the content of the stereotype. And I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So Katherine highlights that stereotypes are regularly applied in contexts in which they are not actually relevant. And in the case that we've got here of women in STEM, she actually suggests this is what's happening. So she says, a stereotype can reflect some aspect of social reality, but influence judgments about other aspects of social reality. So in this kind of situation, a person has acquired a stereotype responsive to evidence in their wider environment, but they go on to act in ways which generate testimonial harm because they apply that stereotype in an irrelevant context. So in the case of women in STEM, the stereotype is not actually relevant to the assessment. As Katherine Puddifoot says, women who enter universities and workplaces to work in STEM subjects are stereotyped as lacking expertise in these credibility deficits, but the stereotype is not relevant in the case where women have gained scientific expertise. It just doesn't seem to be applicable. So in this case, we might say then that someone has made a prejudgment without proper regard to the evidence about a more relevant group, I think, that of women who work in STEM. So the question we should ask is whether this is itself due to prejudice. If prejudice is about being resistant to counter evidence due to effective investments, then in the case of women in STEM, I think that it could be. The case of women in STEM being the case that we're talking about here, not all women in STEM, but it might well be the case that while the initial stereotype is accurate, the failure to consider further relevant evidence within a context in which the specific woman is a STEM professional and therefore must have scientific expertise comes about due to the very same prejudicial views about women that make it the case that in the society one lives within, fewer women than men have received a STEM education, range of career opportunities, which make the stereotype true. So the very fact that the stereotype women are less likely to have scientific expertise than men is true is indicative of prejudice in the background conditions of society. And so when we, for some reason, engage that stereotype in a context in which it actually isn't relevant, that seems to me likely to be suggesting that this willingness to ignore the further relevant evidence is very likely to be due to that same prejudice towards that group of people. So in the case of women in STEM, there are background conditions of prejudice, and applying the stereotype in an irrelevant context seems to suggest that one is being influenced by the same conditions of prejudice which made it the case that the facts in the accurate stereotype were true. To try and sort of explain this, here are a couple of scenarios to illustrate, I hope, the difference between prejudicial and non-prejudicial use of accurate stereotypes. So in the first one, crowdsourcing, and here again, just being inspired by Catherine's examples from the book where she talks about a football match. In crowdsourcing, you have Jono, the journalist. He needs to very quickly get a few pretty innocuous anonymous reactions with regard to Manchester City's victory at the Etihad Stadium earlier that day, just so he can include a couple of quotes in a local news report that's going out live in just a few minutes' time. And he's looking for things like, yeah, it was electrifying, that kind of thing. There's a good chance that many City fans are still in the city centre celebrating the win. Jono has limited time, as we know, so relying on the accurate stereotype that men are more likely than women to attend football matches, Jono approaches a group of men, it takes to be men, sat outside the pub, rather than another group of women he sees outside a different pub over the road to try and find a few supporters to speak to. Now, had a woman actually come up to Jono proactively and said, oh, I watched the match, and offered any insight or just mentioned that, Jono would have absolutely happily asked her for a quote. He has no other biases towards women as football fans. But given the time that they have, Jono's strategy is just to maximize their chance of getting a few good sound bites in time for the live transmission. So Jono just goes for the group of men in order to get a quick response. Now, in this scenario, it seems like the stereotype men are more likely than women to attend football matches was accurate. But it also seems like that stereotype was relevant to the scenario, which is trying to maximize the chance of a good quote in a timely fashion in Manchester Centre. And it doesn't look like any form of epistemic harm or injustice occurred, because nobody was wronged in their capacity as a knower. Nobody was treated as if they weren't a credible football fan. There was no epistemic cost to Jono or their audience in his focus, on Jono's focus, on men. And there was no prejudicial aspect to Jono's behaviour. They would have quite happily responded very quickly to any counter evidence from any woman who spoke to them to get a quote. So that all looks fine to me. Then consider this second example of post-match pub chat. So in this scenario, Elsie, who is a Manchester City fan, and she's wearing a Manchester City shirt, is sat in the pub after going to the match, the same match. Everyone around her is a man. All the other people that she's sat with are men. And everyone's just joining in, as you do after a football match, with a big discussion, talking about the match, the strengths of the players on both sides, and the actions of the referee in a lot of detail. And maybe a couple of times, Elsie tries to explain why she thought the referee made a bad call early in this game. But when she speaks, she's kind of ignored. Nobody takes up her words. Nobody follows on with the point. A few minutes after she makes the point, a man in the pub makes the same point, and everyone joins in with their views in response to him. And it seems very clear here that Elsie is not being treated in a fair manner in terms of her credibility, and the men are. So in this second case, again, the stereotype men are more likely than women to attend football matches is accurate, and there might be some of the things that come off the back of that, which I'll come to in the next bit. But the stereotype men are more likely than women to attend football matches was irrelevant in the given context of listening to Elsie. Additional content that the specific woman present, Elsie, was known to have been at the football match should have overruled any reasonable exclusion of Elsie from the discussion about what happened in the game on the grounds of rules about the general population. So some form of epistemic harm at least occurred, because Elsie seems to have been wronged somehow in her capacity as a knower. And there was some kind of epistemic cost to the group because they failed to capture Elsie's insights and her points. But the question is, was there also a prejudicial aspect to the group's behaviour which would make this testimonial injustice? If this has happened purely because they've bought into the stereotype that men are more likely than women to attend football matches and have disregarded the woman on that basis. Well, I think arguably yes, because the prejudice that's entered in through the background prejudicial beliefs, which has led to fewer women watching football matches in the first place, and the other members of the group having poor responsiveness to evidence, are both related to these background prejudicial views about women and their affinity for football, or their capability of understanding football, and so on. And so all of this together was likely to have led to the downgrading of Elsie's testimony in the presence of the accurate stereotype about the general population. Now, there's not an easy way to prove that this is the case, and it might be cases where this isn't true in some other scenarios involving accurate stereotypes. But we might, at the very least, I think, say that when an accurate negatively valent stereotype is true in virtue of conditions of prejudice, then we've got within a broader environment, and the acts that this leads to, it's very likely one can't have escaped the prejudicial beliefs that led to that stereotype being true. And as a result, a person is not ethically non-culpable for the epistemic harm they cause in a testimonial interaction with someone whose credibility is assessed based on that stereotype. Now, this wouldn't entirely correspond with Fricke's definition of the concept because of where she places the fallaciousness, if you like, of what's going on, the responsiveness to evidence, but it does, I think, represent a reasonable adjustment to it. So that's kind of the first point. And then the second point, which I'll do just very quickly, because I know we're sort of running through time here, is about the role of accurate stereotypes in ordinary testimony and justice. And this is very closely related. And basically here, what I'm saying is that just all of that said, I think there might just be something more fundamental that Puddifoot's, Catherine's notes, sorry, around relevance point to when considering any special considerations we ought to make for cases of testimonial epistemic harm and the use of accurate stereotypes. And this is the question about whether or not the stereotypes being invoked, in a given case of these testimony interactions really are accurate ones given the context. So to examine this, let's just very quickly have a look at some of the stereotypes that could have been involved in Fricke's sort of paradigm case, that of Greenleaf and Sherwood. One might have been that women rely on intuition more than men. Well, this could be accurate given social factors at the time. Another one might be that women are more intuitive than men. Again, that could be accurate. Another stereotype might have been that women are not capable or less capable than men are of rational thought. And again, this may or may not be accurate for a given interpretation of rational. Another one might be that women are less likely to deploy a rational approach to problem solving than men are. And again, this may or may not be true in a given context and for a given interpretation of rational. And a fifth stereotype that might have been involved is just that women are irrational and unable to think rationally, brackets, unlike men. And this might be inaccurate as a blanket statement about women. It certainly would be as a blanket statement of women across all time and space, but it could be accurate under conditions of particular oppression. So in the case of women in STEM being disbelieved, what's actually going on there? Let's just put that up. So there could be the stereotype women lack scientific expertise being invoked in downgrading the credibility of women who speak in science. However, this stereotype can only be considered to be accurate, and this sort of connects to some things I think others have said, it can only be considered to be accurate within a given context. As we've seen, women lack scientific expertise is not a timelessly true statement, it's true about a context. So to know if it's accurate, we need to know what the hidden subclauses are, perhaps. Women taken as a whole in the base rate population of this particular society lack scientific expertise because fewer women than men receive scientific training, for example. And when we take that as the stereotype, then it becomes clear that that's irrelevant to assessing the credibility of a person who does have scientific training, because it's specifically talking about people who don't have scientific training, which means that were we to use that stereotype in making a credibility assessment of somebody's testimony within this context, making an assessment of the woman's testimony, it's not actually connected. So we're being irrational, which is in itself certainly epistemically culpable, or it is connected, but it's actually generating a further inaccurate stereotype. Women who work in science lack scientific expertise. And so there is an inaccurate stereotype at the heart of this after all. And if that's the case, then we might think this looks a lot more like classic cases of testimony and justice after all. Okay, I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. So, Katherine, now it's time for you to reply. I don't know, how do you want to proceed? If you're going just to, if you prepare something, or if you prefer, for example, just to chat or have some sort of interventions from the commentators.
I've prepared some answers to some of the questions, but I've not been able to cover everything. And obviously, like Leonie's, we didn't have a peek at that first, so I have to add that in somewhere. But would it be okay to stop for a couple of minutes, just for a quick break? Because we've been going for quite a while.
Okay, okay. Like 5 minutes or
5
just...
minutes, yeah. I know we're late. But
so, yes, we come back in 25, 26. Okay.
Thank you.
So Katie, I don't know if you want to be interrupted by the commentators or you prefer just to present the whole replies and then maybe some people can ask questions.
Don't mind. I'm actually not sure how long it takes, so maybe I'll just go. I'll talk, and then if anyone's got anything really pressing they want to say, then maybe they could put sign in the chat or something.
So well, there are the two Federicos missing, but I don't know if you want to start or they're there.
I'm sorry, there's been a bit of confusion here at home. So, but I'm here and I'm focused. Thank you.
I will set my slides.
I think Katie, you can start, right?
For me to go, okay. Okay, so yeah, in general, I thought these documents are really helpful and really great. So I'm going to run through some replies. I don't think a lot of it is me being defensive because I think the comments are really helpful. Which is nice. Okay, so I'm going to focus first on Jenny's helpful point about my prescriptive suggestion. So I claim that there's a certain sort of bit of advice that you can follow that falls out of evaluative dispositionalism. That's quite simple, you know, quite straightforward, that you should check dispositions. But Jenny points out that actually this is going to be a really difficult thing to do because when it comes to any particular belief you might have, there'll be various dispositions that you can have attached to any scenario you might be placed in. There's just going to be a sheer number of dispositions. It's going to make it really difficult to work out what dispositions a person has. So if you're wanting to criticize a person for believing a particular thing, your task could just be completely intractable, because if you're going to have a full sense of all the dispositions that are associated with believing, that would be something that's impossible. So I think it's absolutely right. This is something I didn't think about enough, and it could be a serious issue. And I think it means that we certainly need to show some humility when making assessments of people. If we're applying this sort of framework to assess an act of believing a stereotype, we need to bear in mind that there are epistemic barriers to us understanding the dispositions that people have. But I've put a little bit of thought into this. I'm sure hopefully in the end I'll have more to say, but as a first start at responding to this, I guess I would say that even though we might not have a full sense of what dispositions might be associated with believing, when we believe what other people believe, it can still be really important to have an awareness of the types of ways that we might be disposed to respond to evidence in virtue of having a stereotype that we implicitly or explicitly endorse. So I would hope that this book, like in an ideal world, would give people an understanding, a sort of toolkit that they could use to sort of guard against certain errors that they might make because they're disposed to respond in a certain way due to stereotypes. So like seek out blind spots in their own thinking, try and avoid those blind spots, and, you know, fill in details by gathering evidence where they're likely to have not properly responded to evidence because of the stereotyping. Also, I think that it provides us reason to be super vigilant, extra vigilant, and skeptical when we respond to other people and their testimony, when they're telling us about information that they've gathered that's likely to have been shaped by stereotypes. So, I mean, if you think that this description of how stereotypes operate and dispose people to respond is right, then you can consider, if you're evaluating a certain piece of evidence that's really important, say within a legal setting, you can ask questions that can try to probe whether someone is likely to be disposed to respond in certain ways in response to the stereotypes that they have. So say So say someone has harbored a stereotype that they've formed, and this stereotype has influenced their recollection of a certain event. So they then testify about this event, and you're in a situation where, you know, you're trying to work out whether that testimony is to be trusted. Having a sense of the sorts of dispositions that the stereotype might have led them to display when gathering that evidence could be useful. One thing you might do is try to gather information about whether they were in the sorts of conditions where that stereotype might have made them misremember certain information. So one disposition that I talk about is the disposition to selectively remember certain information if you're influenced by stereotypes. So the idea here would be that you wouldn't need a complete accurate picture of the various dispositions that a person has in order to evaluate their act of believing or to make use of this approach, because you could use the approach within a particular scenario to work out the types of errors that a person might have made due to the dispositions that they could have had, because stereotypes tend to bring those sorts of dispositions. So yeah, hopefully, even admitting that we need to be humble and recognize the limits to our understanding of dispositions, we can use a framework to try and evaluate individual beliefs that might have been influenced by stereotypes. I also think that having this point brought to light is useful because there's a certain lesson in it about our ignorance. So part of what I'm arguing is that certain social information can be useful in some hands while at the same time damaging in others. So this idea that this information about the statistical reality of expertise in science across the UK, that information can be useful when a certain person who's disposed to use that information in a certain way has that information, but less useful when in another person's hands. So if that's right, then this which disposition argument highlights actually how difficult it can be to discern for any individual whether or not they're likely to be one of those people for whom it's okay that they have that information, because they're unlikely to be disposed poorly to respond to the information as a result of having it and forming a relevant stereotype. So in a way, this awareness of our inability to discern for any person or the dispositions that they have gives us extra reason to be cautious in trusting people who engage in stereotyping generally, because we should recognize the limits to our understanding of the sorts of dispositions that they have. But that's not to say that the framework isn't useful, just that we need to use it in particular ways that haven't thought through in enough detail. So this idea that the position might have more radical implications than I lay out in the book, I very much welcome. I think, it's an interesting way to take the ideas, and I'm not sure I've really come up with any objections to moving in this direction. So here's the claim: what dispositions people have arising from any belief depends on many other facts about them, including, crucially, what other things they believe. So the idea here being that it's not just a specific stereotyping belief or act of believing a stereotype that ought to be evaluated, but rather a broader set of beliefs that a person might have, also other factors about them. And I think Federico, as Jenny said, actually is coming to a similar sort of point with the Nora example, that in that example, the stereotype seems to have only a limited causal role. So because the two individuals both harbour the stereotype, but they respond in different ways, the stereotype isn't doing all the work in needing the person to be disposed to react in a certain way, which means that it does seem to be important to shift attention away from purely the specific belief, but also consider the broader context. So how would I respond to this? Well, again, these are sort of preliminary thoughts, but yeah. The aim of evaluative dispositionalism was to highlight the importance of considering for each act of stereotyping or believing a stereotype, how it disposes people to respond to evidence. But yeah, I build into the examples that there will be individual differences between how people are disposed to respond to evidence as a result of harbouring the stereotyping belief. So, and it seems like there could be various different things that determine whether or not things go one way or another in terms of the dispositions people have as a result of stereotyping. So, yeah, beliefs seem to be one other important thing that can interact with the stereotyping belief and determine what dispositions are shown. A person's personality and situational factors could also determine this. So given this, it does seem right that stereotyping beliefs shouldn't be considered in isolation. It's important to consider how, given other factors like other beliefs a person has, like whether or not they have feminist beliefs, stereotypes dispose them to respond to information. But I don't think this is to diminish the evaluative dispositionalist approach. It's still important to focus on the dispositions that are associated with believing a stereotype. But I think it's absolutely right that the book doesn't place sufficient emphasis on those other factors, other beliefs that a person might hold, other situations people might be, or personality traits they might have that could determine how the stereotype, once harboured, can influence how they are disposed to respond to information. In a case where the stereotype had literally no causal role, it didn't impact on the dispositions that were displayed at all, I just would say that you would be focusing on completely the wrong thing if you're focusing or thinking what you were doing was evaluating the stereotype by looking at the dispositions. But I just think that in the cases that I describe, hopefully if I've described them as I want to, there is a causal role, and it's not like the stereotyping is doing all the work, but if you want to understand the stereotyping, then we need to understand its place amongst those other things in disposing people to respond in a certain way. So, yeah, I'm happy to accept that the stereotype alone shouldn't be the object of evaluation or the act of believing the stereotype, because there's going to be a more complex story that to be told about how someone becomes disposed to respond in a certain way to evidence. Okay, so both Federicos object to this idea that egalitarian beliefs guarantee epistemic benefits and avoid epistemic costs. So on the one hand, we have this example of someone who endorses a negative belief about scientists that's egalitarian because it associates men and women both with being bad at science. So this could indeed, it seems, have certain effects that I associate with stereotyping, leading to the misinterpretation of ambiguous information. So if you just generally think that people aren't good at science, but someone shows evidence that they may or may not be good at science, then sure, you might be more likely to interpret that evidence as showing that they don't have expertise. I think that's right, and it is something I hadn't thought about. I'll say more in response in a minute, but just first of all, thank you, both of you, for raising this point. Marina says, the point here is that the distortion of case-specific information is a consequence of basing the assessment of individual traits on a generalization, regardless of whether the whether it has egalitarian or non-egalitarian content. I mean, I guess I think that to an extent I agree with that. I think certain of the epistemic pitfalls associated with stereotyping just come as a result of there being generalizations made, but I think that that's not going to be universally the case. So how do I respond? Well, first of all, I do think it's important to emphasize I am only saying that sometimes the epistemic benefits of having the egalitarian belief will outweigh the costs. So this isn't like a broad generalization I'm making myself. I mean, perhaps I need to rethink about how bold the claims are that I'm making in the book. But yeah, just as a first defense. But I also think that having an egalitarian attitude can actually protect against specific epistemic costs. But tell me if you think I'm wrong about this. But I think that there are certain of the epistemic pitfalls, ways that people are disposed to respond to evidence poorly as a result of stereotyping that are unlikely to follow from egalitarian beliefs. So one of the things I point towards is the way that when people are stereotyping, they fail to see similarities between different groups. So there it seems like it's the emphasis on the difference, the stereotyping emphasizing the difference that leads to the epistemic error. So to the extent that any of the errors that I point towards have this emphasis on difference, I think that they're not going to be as likely to occur when an egalitarian attitude is in place. So perhaps what I need to do going forward is think about how many of those do have that feature. Things like explaining behavior by reference to group membership. I think that if what you're doing is identifying a similarity between different groups, then that you're less likely to be explaining something in terms of group membership. So yeah, what these comments have encouraged me to do is think more carefully about which of the individual epistemic costs or harms or pitfalls associated with stereotyping are more closely tied to the stereotyping. But also, I kind of welcome the suggestion that the egalitarian beliefs could have similar sorts of effects. So part of arguing that the egalitarian attitudes could have benefits was like a strategic move, like like a rhetorical move, like, if given that things can be really bad with stereotypes that are accurate, you can really understand that if you see how maybe just having a falsely egalitarian belief can have benefits. But like putting that sort of move, that rhetorical move aside, I think it is interesting to explore this idea that egalitarian beliefs can have similar effects. The idea particularly that we might misremember or selectively remember information from the past in line with egalitarian beliefs. I think, given that what I talk with Marina about quite a lot of the time, I think it's worth thinking more about that, the extent to which egalitarian attitudes can bring that same sort of memory effect, and how that could actually potentially lead to something like an injustice, or in fact an injustice. So yeah, I think partly I want to say thank you. It'd be useful and interesting to explore those ideas some more. So this actually wasn't in your talk, Federico, I don't think, but it was in the written version that I had, but ties in, I think, with that last point. So when I'm describing evaluative dispositionalism, I do use these examples like football examples and things. And at certain points, I think there is a certain ambiguity about whether I take this view to apply only to stereotyping beliefs, or I take it to apply more broadly. I think that's partly because I have a sneaking ambition to say it applies more broadly. I just didn't have the space to do it in the book. So the idea that egalitarian beliefs might have a similar effect, I mean, maybe that's a way into thinking about more broadly how believing and acts of believing can bring dispositions that it's worthwhile focusing on alongside the dispositions that are shown when forming those beliefs. So yeah, something to look at and think about. I actually have written a paper which I might return to, I kind of abandoned, on the way that being in an echo chamber might be captured by evaluative dispositionalism, because once you're in the echo chamber, you can dispose to respond in various ways to evidence, and ending up there can happen as a result of being in a really vicious epistemic environment, but can also happen as a result, I think, you just being epistemic. Anyway, but yeah, so I think there's more to be said, and yeah, one day I might say it, or someone else. So, and then there is this useful distinction between the normative and descriptive stereotypes. I haven't really got a lot to say about this, apart from that I think it's really interesting. So you've got descriptive stereotypes that characterize women in a way that undermines their competences and effectiveness. Normative stereotypes label women whose behavior is inappropriately masculine as deviant. So someone might abandon their epistemic goals, focus instead of disapproving of certain people, and that in this process might generate certain facts or understandings of people's behavior that are misleading. So they're not being appropriately epistemically vigilant, but generating a way of viewing the world that's misleading. And that's really interesting. I guess it kind of fits with some of the ideas I've been having recently about the potential interplay between stereotypes that control people's behavior and our epistemic environment. So actually for Leonie, and for your volume on poverty, I talk a little bit about something along these lines, so the way that stereotypes and stereotyping can generate information, misleading information about people in a way by controlling the way that they act. So I certainly think that it's an interesting topic, although I hadn't thought of it in the particular way I've had raised here. So I think there are resonances with the work of people like Hill Collins, Erin Beagley and Ines Webster. So yeah, so just in general, I agree that there can be these interesting cases where stereotypes are sort of saying something about how people should behave or controlling how people do behave, and as a result creating a sort of hostile, misleading epistemic environment. Okay, so I have a few more points about the single and dual factor view. So a couple of you picked up on this idea of relevance, which I just hadn't really thought was very controversial, and it was interesting to hear that it is controversial. I guess I wasn't thinking of a stereotype as always being relevant when it's applied to someone who's within the scope of the stereotype. It seemed to be something more than that. So it wasn't just that if you have an association between members of a certain group and, say, criminality, and a person falls within that particular group, then the stereotype is relevant. I was thinking that was something more than that, something like a stereotype is relevant if it speaks to the truth of the judgment. But then I did wonder whether that's bringing in some sort of like building in some sort of epistemic benefit into the definition. So I think that's just something I need to think about more. And then I think I can probably leave those other things, and if anyone wants to discuss them more, they can raise them. I wanted to talk about, though, this epistemic injustice stuff. So I've written a few papers on epistemic injustice now, and I just feel like I'm at risk of being seriously inconsistent, because I grapple with this idea about the scope of testimonial injustice and how broadly you should apply it. So I have this paper on memory error and how people can reasonably respond to memory error, and that can be something like testimonial injustice, but I want to say it's not. So maybe I was just trying to be consistent with that here, but yeah. And I do think there's some value to distinguishing between cases where there's prejudice and cases where there's not prejudice. But I just think, Leonie, you've made a really good case that it's not straightforward, that there is no prejudice here. I'm glad that you had this view that Fricke was thinking of the prejudice as like lying in the sort of formation of the stereotype, because that was how I was seeing it. There was of an epistemically culpable failure in sort of the acquisition of the stereotype, which I thought isn't there, at least in the same way, and isn't obviously there in the case where the stereotype is reflecting reality. But I think you're definitely right that the picture is going to be more complicated, and certainly where people are displaying some of the errors that I'm pointing towards and saying, well, these are these are the problems with these stereotypes that are seemingly accurate. Maybe, yeah, if you look in detail at the idea that people are applying stereotypes when they're not relevant, well, yeah, why are they doing that? Is there something in that which is actually manifesting some sort of prejudice? I think, yeah, you're quite possibly just, yeah, right there. And what you've done is really helpful to try and fill out the details there. And I think it's right, there's definitely possibilities for there to be different definitions of prejudice that complicate the picture altogether. So, I mean, if you think like prejudice is about a failure to respond appropriately to evidence, or a disposition to fail to appropriately respond to evidence, which is something like Appy's view, I think, then you might well think that where someone is failing to respond appropriately to testimonial evidence, they're displaying the sort of disposition that sort of constitutes prejudice. And then that sort of move certainly gives you reason to resist the move that I make, which is just simply saying the absence of prejudice suggests there's no testimonial injustice. So yeah, I guess I'd like to talk more on that. looking forward to thinking more about what you said. So yeah, I think that's all that I've got, but happy to answer any questions or chat with anyone about anything if we have time.
Oh, thank you, Katherine. Maybe you can, yes, stop sharing the screen. So I don't know, we spent a lot of time already, so maybe if we want to speak a little, like 10 minutes or something like that. If you have any questions or you just want to discuss about some particular point. Everyone is tired.
Yeah, it doesn't show.
Also thinking about Kathy further comments. So, well, first of all, thank you for taking into consideration our comments so carefully. So thank you. And well, just to push a little bit further on the point regarding egalitarian attitudes, just to there is something kind in your answer, in the sense that you did the effort of reducing the scope in order to accommodate. That's something very unusual, that is. But maybe it is possible to insist on some broader scope. No, maybe that's it's something strange to me to say it, because I'm putting forward the objection to it, but because other ways, if it is only sometimes, no, it is only sometimes, it seems that we could say the same regarding non-egalitarian attitudes. No, so we could say the same, that sometimes non-egalitarian attitudes, so it wouldn't be a difference between having one kind of attitude or the other.
I mean, there might be a difference of degree. So one thing I was thinking about, I didn't quite get around to fully formulating the thought, was that even in the memory case, it might be that there's something about like being a categorical judgment being made. So one explanation of why people remember in a biased way, they're more likely to remember information that's consistent with the stereotype, is that the information fits into an existing schema. So, and the idea being that people also, in some conditions, remember in a way that's they're better at remembering counter-stereotypical information because they have the time to process it. So that they like, so it might be that if we look case by case at each of the individual epistemic pitfalls, then we find that for each case, it's actually more likely that that's going to happen in response to a stereotype that is comparative like that, that's making the distinction and isn't egalitarian. So I think this is going to be one of those devil is in the details sort of cases, but you know, I don't want to, without doing that work, and I have only had your responses for a week, so not really had the time to like do it more, but it'd be interesting to explore, to like to work out that the extent to which you're going to find the same effects, or which of the same effects you're likely to find. And like, you know, my hunch is you're just going to find that there are more epistemic costs associated with the inegalitarian attitude, so more benefits associated with having the egalitarian one. So I mean, there might be cases, and maybe this is unnecessary. I was just going to give you another example. Like, there might be cases where people have this association with all scientists with being poor science, but you know, I think it's more likely, more commonplace that people will have a stereotype associating one gender, or like some members of some perceived racial groups over others with expertise in an area. So it might be just like the extent to which people are susceptible to certain errors will track the extent to which they're likely to make certain associations. They might be less likely to have the egalitarian attitude, and so egalitarian attitude is like less likely to bring cost because it's less likely to be in existence. So I think working out those sorts of details will be helpful, and it's been good to be encouraged to do that.
Yes, Jenny.
So I was just wanting to say, thinking a bit more about the very many dispositions problem. And I feel tempted a bit to say that rather than being humble but trying to evaluate all the dispositions, what we should do is think about how this stereotype has functioned in this context, and then assess that. Right. I mean, it'll be just the dispositions relevant to what has actually happened. But then I start realizing, wait, but hang on, that's just being a consequentialist, and it's no longer a dispositionalist view. And so I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I had jotted down in context. I haven't gone any further than that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I guess you're manifesting a disposition that you would have been disposed to manifest in other contexts. So having an awareness of the types of dispositions that are likely to be manifest in a particular context could allow you to discern, well, at least have more tools in your toolkit to work out whether someone has manifested that disposition in this context. I think it's going to be... No, you go.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. Sorry.
No, I don't know. I've lost the thought now anyway.
I'm sorry. So I was thinking another move might be to think about like the range of relevant circumstances. So that's something people sometimes do to make it easier to think about dispositions. So, you know, if Albert's a bartender, then the range of there's just no real relevant circumstances you don't have to think about. But if he's running the funding agency, then the range of relevant circumstances is different from if he's on the hiring committee. And so maybe you think about the set of dispositions that would manifest in the relevant circumstances, given the social role, perhaps, as a way of limiting it and making it more readily valuable.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful. Yeah.
Anyway, just
yeah, that's something I'll think about.
Yes, Leonie.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll just try and keep to one question. I just wanted to see what you think about it. Because part of what I was thinking about with the second sort of possible response is to do with, really, I think the difference between that broad scale stereotypes and narrow stereotypes. And I wondered if you had a view on how broad, I guess, how broad a stereotype can be and still be considered to be accurate when applied in a context, and how narrow a stereotype can get before it's not really a stereotype. It's kind of talking about things. So there's two different things there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, there's just this question about what it is to say that a stereotype is accurate. And it's really just so hard to give an answer to that question. And this has kind of led to some of the terminology that I think is slightly like non-ideal in the book, talking about an attitude reflecting or fitting with statistical information, because I think that, you know, without a clear sense of the psychological underpinnings of the stereotypes, you know, are they generic, like, are they prototypes? Are they, you know, actually saying anything about exactly what makes something accurate is difficult. I mean, like, part of the project is just to call into question whether or not something that seems at face value to be accurate can be trusted. And one of the things that you usefully do is spell out a way that one reason why you might not trust a stereotype, because it might seem as if it's accurate when described at a certain level of generalization and abstraction, but if you were to unpack the details, you would see that actually no, like it's not accurate. So I mean, yeah, I mean, it's just, I think it's such a difficult question, and partly I just think that all we can do is sort of put pressure on the idea that certain things should be deemed to be accurate according to some sort of commonsensical notion of what statistics are out there in the world and which ones they might reflect. And in fact, maybe having a coarser and fine-grained approach where you are spelling out how the details of these stereotypes might play out in, you know, in different contexts, how some people might be using the stereotype in one way, whereas someone else is using it in another way. In a way, it sort of puts extra pressure on this idea that we should be assuming that these things are accurate, when I just, yeah. I would be loath really to say of any stereotype that is accurate, just because I don't really understand what that would mean given the psychology of it. So yeah, that isn't an answer, but those are some thoughts.
Yeah, it's just interesting to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Federico?
Hi, yeah, so I had a sort of a thought, half-baked idea. I don't know, it's still my brain is still wearing out. I don't know if it makes sense at all, but I was trying to sort of put together Jenny's idea that perhaps we should not focus our epistemic appraisal on an individual attitude, but consider a package. And then of course there's a question of how wide should that package be? But putting this together with Leonie's very interesting thought about the fact that perhaps in testimonial injustice, we don't necessarily have to locate the identity prejudice within the stereotype, but we might locate it like farther down the line. Yeah, so so if Jenny is correct, and intuitively it makes sense to me what she's saying. I mean, it might, all of this might call into question also the standard definition that is given to testimonial injustice. So this idea that there is an event, let's call it an event, like the identity prejudice, which causes a certain epistemic outcome, like a credibility deficit and so on and so forth. So there isn't such a thing as a discrete event that causes the credibility deficit. Is a conjoined event made of a variety of attitudes, cognitive and conative, and it's perhaps impossible to actually define this conjoined event, define the contours of this conjoined event. So I do wonder, I mean, to what extent this actually might create issues for the very like detectability of testimonial injustice. I know there's this debate in the literature about whether like individual instances of testimonial injustice are ever detectable, but yeah, I do wonder whether when you actually depart from the apparently very simple and apparently very sensible definition of testimonial injustice that Fricker gives, and you accept this idea that the original event is not as simple. Sorry, this is really a mess. I'm trying to do my best, but it's not really as simple as she puts it. Well, perhaps there's the other issue of detectability. I'll stop here.
If we combine the idea that you shouldn't just be looking at the individual act of believing, and the idea that this view could be applied more broadly, then I guess that could be like quite a radical outcome of it. So yeah, I don't know what we think about that, but yeah.
If I may add just one consideration to this last point, because I see the point raised by Jennifer regarding the fact that we shouldn't evaluate single act of stereotyping or uses of a stereotype. But just to add one consideration to that issue is that we have some institutional designs that demand us to do that. For example, regarding how a judge used a stereotype in order to assess the credibility or attendability of testimony or other kind of proof. Within the theory of legal evidence, it is usual to say that stereotypes as generalizations are dangerous but necessary. No, it's something that we cannot avoid. We cannot avoid using that kind of element in order to construe. They are the glue that keep together the evidence reasoning. Well, sometimes we need elements to evaluate an act of stereotyping. That's something that is there is an ongoing discussion between legal scholars regarding on how to evaluate uses of stereotypes or acts of stereotyping by judges, and I think that elements that allow us to do that regarding concrete acts of stereotyping is very, very useful. And just to add that.
Yes, I don't know if Kathy, you want to reply or just we go to Jenny's question.
If Jenny, were you responding to this, Jenny?
Yeah, but I don't want to step on your toes. But it was making me think that perhaps it's especially important to look not just at whether it's an act of stereotyping, but exactly what it's doing. So what you need to show with the judge is not just that they hold the stereotype, but that the stereotype plays this role in their reasoning, perhaps. And so the problem isn't what background stereotypes you have, but whether it's affecting the judgments. I don't know if that works, but I was wondering if that could be a useful distinction.
Katie?
I don't think I really have much to add. I guess it would be interesting to hear to what extent that sort of idea could be built into legal advice or guidelines, so that, or whether to some extent you're already describing the sorts of thing we're suggesting, so that like the stereotype can be sort of justifiably used in some contexts, but what we need to understand is the role it's going to play in someone's thinking, and that is going to require understanding more about them. But maybe that's just a difficulty. Maybe if you were to try and apply this approach where we don't just evaluate the act of stereotyping or the display of the act of stereotyping, but also consider the dispositions. How do you actually work out what a judge's dispositions might be? It might just be that it's impractical. But then on the other hand, it might be that is a sort of investigation that should be done, a consideration of the sorts of dispositions that are associated for that judge with believing the stereotype. And yeah.
Federico?
Yeah, so just one quick thing. I think Federico is absolutely right that I mean is quoting from I think Twining and Schum when he says, I mean, and Schum specifically, he says that they are the glue that sticks the facts together. That's correct. Perhaps just to dispel the problem to an extent, I believe it's true that most of the generalizations that are relied upon in court are not actually stereotypes according to Kathy's definition. And this is not so much because they're not comparative, because some of them are, but it's because they do not associate our people or our group of people or individuals with a particular trait, but they tend to associate a type of fact with another type of fact. As in, this particular trace found at the scene of the crime is indicative of the identity of the defendant, or is indicative of whatever other fact. So they tend to be like sort of generalizations that tie together facts as opposed to traits with people. But Federico is absolutely right that there is also use of generalizations that in fact that might match the distinction. Sorry, the definition that Kathy is giving us. So sorry, I just wanted to contribute this.
But I guess also if we think that some of the problems are associated with generalization in general, rather than specific associations made with social groups, maybe this sort of problem could arise. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's correct. Although then I guess the ethical dimensions would be very different. For instance, you would not incur the risk of testimonial injustice, say, if you're merely associating like objects or facts or types of evidence or whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's possible that we would have similar pitfalls, but I don't think the full like panoply of pitfalls that you described.
Leonie?
It was just a final worsening of it. I was just thinking that might be true if it's just the subject attached to the subject, but if the social conditions are such that the reason these things are associated with another is because of background conditions that are themselves prejudicial, then you might just be pushing the problem sort of further back, which isn't very helpful. I just thinking it might still be part of the same problem.
It'd be nice to be able to go out for a drink now.
Yes, unfortunately, we are very far away. Well, I don't know if someone else has something to say, or if we finish here. Yes, I think it was a very nice discussion, and there were like a lot of elements I'm just following because all this is a little new for me, like the social epistemology part. But yes, it was. I really stick with this idea of if we can judge or evaluate a specific act of stereotyping, and I do believe, as Federico said, that in some cases it may be relevant, maybe not in all cases, right? Like in everyday acts with people, it's more about, yes, context and other things that are not maybe in place when we are trying to know if the testimony was dismissed because a stereotype was in place or not in a legal domain. But well, that's the thing that I got, and well, all of your comments. So thank you for this, and to Katie and to all the commentators. So maybe we can.
And thank you for organizing this.
Okay.
Yeah,
well,
thank you.
I will try to upload the video to the website. Sorry, I don't know why it didn't work. It was supposed to work, it didn't. So, well, so maybe they will edit something and then it will stay there in YouTube forever.
Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you.
Great to see you.
Sure.
Thanks, Marina. Thanks, Kathy.
Well, and
Thanks,
then
everyone.
I will just email you. I will just stop recording.